Imagine living completely by yourself in a small rental house on the edge of town. It was a simple, one-story place located at the end of a quiet, dead-end road. On this entire street, there were only 5 houses, and because of this, night times were incredibly quiet. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, so my daily routine was pretty repetitive. I rarely left the house unless I absolutely had to grab groceries or run a quick errand. Visitors were a rare sight for me. My friends always knew to text me before they decided to drop by, so I never really expected anyone to just show up. That is why the first knock on my door stood out so much. It was about 8:45 on a Thursday night. I was sitting comfortably in my living room watching some television when suddenly I heard 4 very firm, deliberate knocks on my front door. I paused for a second, muted the television, and waited. At first, I thought maybe I had just imagined the sound, but then 2 more sharp knocks followed. I stood up and walked slowly toward the front door. Right in the center of the door, there was a small peephole. I stepped up to it and looked through. On my front porch stood a man holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He was wearing a dark jacket and a simple baseball cap. To be honest, he looked completely normal, maybe in his mid-30s. I opened the door, but kept the security chain firmly attached. The moment the door opened slightly, the man immediately spoke up. He told me he had a delivery that required a signature. He then looked down at a small handheld electronic device and read a name out loud. The problem was, it was not my name at all. It was not even close. I looked at him and said that he had the wrong address. He looked down at the box, then back at his device, and then directly at me. He read the address out loud, and this time, it was my exact address, word for word. I shook my head and told him that absolutely nobody by that name lived at this address. The man just stood there and stared at me for a second or two longer than was necessary. It felt incredibly awkward. Finally, he said that he must have been given the wrong information, and that he would take the package back to his truck. I watched through the window as he walked back down my driveway. I expected to see a delivery van or some kind of car parked nearby, but there was absolutely nothing. He just walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the road. I could not see where he went after that. I shut the door, locked it, and went back inside. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a delivery driver working for a small company, or maybe a contractor using their own unmarked vehicle. It seemed like a logical explanation, so I tried to let it go. But the very next night, at almost the exact same time, around 8:45, the knocks came again. This time, there were 3 of them. I felt a sudden spike of anxiety. I did not open the door this time. Instead, I went straight to the peephole to see who was outside. It was the exact same man, wearing the same dark jacket, and holding the exact same cardboard box. I refused to open the door. I just spoke loudly through the wood, telling him that he had already come by the night before, and that nobody by that name lived here. There was a long, heavy silence. Then the man spoke up, saying that he really just needed a signature, and that his system showed the package absolutely had to be delivered tonight. I told him firmly that I was not going to sign for a package meant for someone I did not know. Another long pause followed. Then, he simply said okay, and took a step back from the door. I kept my eye pressed against the peephole. Instead of turning around and walking away immediately, he just stood at the edge of my porch, looking around. He slowly turned his head toward my front windows, then toward the dark side of the house, and then looked right back at the front door. After about 15 seconds of this, he finally walked down the driveway. Once again, there was no vehicle anywhere in sight. That was the moment when everything started to feel deeply wrong. On the 3rd night, there were no knocks. I actually felt an immense wave of relief wash over me. I thought that maybe he had finally figured out his mistake and moved on. I even made a little joke to myself about how bizarre it would have been if he actually showed up for a 3rd time. But on the 4th night, that relief completely vanished. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Suddenly, I heard 4 knocks, but the problem was, they did not come from the front door. They came from the side of the house, right against my dining room window. I froze, holding a wet plate in my hands. I slowly walked into the dining room and stared at the window, but I could not see anyone through the glass. Then, almost instantly, 4 more heavy knocks echoed from the front door. My heart began to pound. I hurried over to the peephole and looked through. It was him again, but this time something was different. He was not holding a box anymore. His hands were completely empty. I stayed absolutely silent, hoping he would think nobody was home. He knocked again, harder this time. Then he stepped back and stared directly at the peephole, almost as if he knew I was standing right there looking at him. I quickly backed away from the door, making sure not to make a single sound or cause any movement that might show through the lens. After about 30 seconds, he finally turned around and walked away. I waited for 5 full minutes, letting the silence stretch out, before I dared to check the windows. I walked through the house with all the lights turned off, carefully parting the blinds just a fraction of an inch to look outside. And that was when I saw him. He was standing directly across the street, right near the tree line. He was completely motionless, just standing there in the dark, facing my house. After about a minute of watching him, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the woods. I went around the entire house and relocked every single window and door, even though I knew they were already locked. The very next day, I decided I had enough. I called the local police non-emergency line and explained the entire situation to the officer on duty. The officer listened carefully and told me that this sounded like a classic case of someone trying to verify occupancy. He explained that burglars will often knock on doors to see if anyone answers before they attempt to break in later on. He advised me to install some security cameras if I could, and told me to call 911 immediately if the man returned. That night, I decided to play it safe. I left all the front lights of the house completely off and stayed in my bedroom at the back. Right on cue, around 8:45, I heard those 4 familiar knocks at the front door. I stayed completely still and did not respond. A few seconds later, there were 4 more knocks, followed by a heavy silence. I waited in the dark, holding my breath. A minute went by, and then I heard a brand new sound. It was a soft, dull thud against the back of the house, followed by another one. I suddenly realized what was happening. Someone was testing my back door. I grabbed my phone, slipped out of bed, and quietly walked into the hallway. From there, I could clearly hear the metal doorknob of the back door slowly turning. It would turn, stop, and then turn again. I immediately dialed 911, keeping my voice down to a terrified whisper, and told the dispatcher that someone was actively trying to break into my house. While I was on the phone, the knocking suddenly started up again at the front door. The dispatcher assured me that officers were already on their way to my location, but the back doorknob just kept turning, and then I heard a light, metallic scraping sound against the door frame. It sounded like someone was trying to jam a tool into the lock. It became clear to me that there was more than one person out there. After about 30 agonizing seconds, all the noises suddenly stopped. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher in absolute silence until I finally saw the flashing blue lights of the police cars reflecting through my windows. When the officers searched the exterior of the house, they found fresh pry marks on the back door, right next to the handle. One of the officers told me straight out that if I had not been home to secure the house and call them, the door would have likely been forced wide open. They searched the surrounding neighborhood, but could not find anyone suspicious that night. The next evening, I decided I could not stay there anymore. I packed a small bag and went to stay at my brother's apartment on the other side of town. I made sure not to post anything about my whereabouts on social media. I just left. Around 9 o'clock that night, my phone started ringing. It was my neighbor who lived 2 houses down. She asked me if I was home because she could see someone standing on my front porch, knocking repeatedly. She said he had been standing there for at least 5 minutes. I told her I was not home and asked if he had a car parked nearby. She said she did not see any vehicle at all. I asked her to call the police right away. When the officers arrived, they found the man still on my porch and began questioning him. Later that night, an officer called me to give me an update. He said the man claimed he was simply trying to deliver a package but had somehow misplaced it. However, he did not have any company identification, no delivery uniform, and no marked vehicle. The police gave him a strong warning to stay away from the property and let him go. But the story did not end there. Just 2 days later, the police arrested the exact same man in a nearby neighborhood. He had been caught red-handed attempting to break into a house whose owners were away on vacation. When the police searched his car, they found several empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that was completely fake and not connected to any real delivery company. During his interrogation, he finally admitted to his entire method. He confessed that he would knock on doors holding a fake package as a test. If someone answered, he would pretend it was a mistaken delivery, leave, and mark the house as occupied. But if nobody answered after multiple attempts, he would return later that night to force his way inside. He even told the detectives that he would sometimes knock several nights in a row just to study the patterns of the residents. If he saw lights on one night and completely dark the next, he would assume the residents were out and that the house was safe to rob. Hearing those words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I realized just how incredibly close I had come to disaster during that first week. If I had decided to ignore the door on those early nights, he probably would have broken in while I was asleep or away. 3 months later, as soon as my lease was up, I packed my things and moved out of that house. To this day, I still refuse to answer the door at night unless I know exactly who is coming. If I hear an unexpected knock, I stay completely quiet and check my security cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up on my porch with a package that has my address but not my name, I do not even think about going near the door. Now, let us move on to another story that took place during a time of year that is supposed to be filled with joy and family warmth, but instead turned into an absolute nightmare. This event began in the cold winter days leading up to Christmas in a town near Glasgow, Scotland. At the time, I was 16 years old, just about to turn 17. I lived in a lovely home with my parents, my siblings, and our family dogs and cats. We were a very close family, and we loved spending our winter evenings together in the living room, watching movies, playing games, and just catching up on each other's lives. It was one of those cozy nights when we were all gathered around the television watching A Christmas Carol. This was a classic tradition for us, and I always looked forward to it. But right in the middle of the movie, we heard a sudden knock at the front door. Since it was the holiday season, we did not think much of it, assuming it might be a neighbor or a delivery. My mom got up from her chair and went to answer it, but when she opened the door, the front porch was completely empty. There was nobody there. Our garden wrapped all the way from the front of the house to the back, so she checked the side paths, but she found absolutely nothing. She came back inside, slightly confused, and we went back to watching our movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the living room table, focusing hard on some exam preparation work. The house was quiet when suddenly I heard that same knock at the front door. I put my pen down, got up, and went to open it. Once again, there was absolutely nobody there. The street was completely still. At that point, we all assumed it must be some local neighborhood kids playing a prank. In Scotland, there is a very common game that kids play called Chappie. The rules are simple. Kids run up to a house, knock as hard as they can, and then run away laughing to hide. It is a silly game, but for kids, the quick rush of adrenaline from seeing an adult open an empty door is strangely exciting. We had a family group chat where we would keep each other updated, and over the course of that week, several other family members posted that they had experienced the exact same random knocks. But the one incident that really started to worry us happened to my dad. My dad was a bit of a night owl back then. He would usually stay up much later than the rest of the house, either playing video games on his Xbox or watching television once everyone else had gone to sleep. One night around 11:30, when the entire street was completely silent and all the neighborhood kids were definitely inside their homes, my dad heard a very quiet, gentle knock on the door. He was immediately confused because of how late it was. He walked over to the door and looked through the peephole first, but he did not see anyone. He slowly unlocked the door and opened it to look out into the night. The street was totally empty and silent. He locked the door back up, came upstairs, and asked if any of us had heard the noise. But because the knock had been so incredibly quiet, the rest of us had been fast asleep and heard nothing. This was the moment when a strange feeling of unease began to settle over the household. It was happening too often, and yet nobody had ever seen or heard anyone running away. Usually, when kids play Chappie, you can hear them whispering, giggling, or running down the pavement. But with these knocks, there was only ever dead silence. It felt like someone was standing there, knocking, and then just vanishing into thin air. When Christmas Day finally arrived, we tried to put the weird occurrences out of our minds. We spent the entire day opening presents, sharing gifts, playing family games, and eating far too much food. It was a wonderful, happy day, But later that night, all that rich holiday food started to catch up with me, and I began to feel really sick to my stomach. I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom to lie down for a bit. I ended up falling asleep and woke up much later. I reached over to check my phone, and the screen read 2:01 in the morning. The entire house was pitch black and completely silent. Everyone else had gone to bed hours ago. I knew right away that I would not be able to fall back asleep, because once I wake up in the middle of the night, my mind starts racing and sleep becomes impossible. So I just stayed in bed, scrolling through social media on my phone in the dark, watching videos of people showing off their Christmas presents, and texting a few friends who were also still awake. It is that typical holiday break behavior when you do not have school or any real responsibilities, and you just want to enjoy the late night freedom. But then, in the middle of the silence, I heard a very faint, muffled knock. I froze. I could not tell if the sound had come from my bedroom door, my window, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me because of all the weird events from the previous weeks. I sat up straight in my bed, staring into the darkness of my room with my heart pounding against my ribs. I was too terrified to move. I knew for a fact that absolutely nobody should be outside our house at 2 in the morning on Christmas night. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, so the idea of someone knocking on my window seemed almost impossible. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered enough courage to get out of bed and open my bedroom door. But just as I cracked it open, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. My brain instantly tried to rationalize it. I thought it must be my dad coming up to bed after staying up late to play his games. I stepped out onto the landing, fully intending to tell him that I was still awake. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I realized with absolute horror that it was not my dad. Standing on the stairs was a complete stranger, a man I had never seen before in my entire life. I felt a wave of pure sickness wash over me. I wondered if this was the person who had been knocking on our door all those weeks, and now he was already inside our home. He was staggering and swaying as he climbed the steps, looking heavily intoxicated. I slowly backed away into my bedroom, desperately praying he would not notice me. Fortunately, he was too disoriented to look up, and I managed to quietly shut my door. I stood there, listening intently as his footsteps shuffled around the landing. I could hear him opening doors, walking into one room after another. I realized with sheer panic that it was only a matter of time before he reached my door. I was completely frozen. All my logic and sense seemed to vanish in that moment of pure terror. After a few moments, I gently cracked my door open again to see where he was. I saw him stumbling out of my younger sister's bedroom. Seeing him near my sister's room finally snapped my brain back into action. I slipped out of my room, ran straight to my parents' bedroom, and shook them awake, whispering frantically that there was an intruder inside the house. My mom woke up instantly, but my dad was still groggy and confused. We all crept downstairs together to see what was happening. When we reached the living room, we were shocked to find the man completely passed out on our couch. He had found my dad's beer bottles, opened several of them, and scattered them all over the floor around him. My mom immediately lost her temper and began shouting at him to get out of our house. The man stirred slightly, opened his eyes, and angrily started insisting that this was his house and that we were the ones who needed to leave. We tried to pull him up, but his body was completely limp, like dead weight. My mom even slapped him across the face to try and wake him up, but he barely reacted. Just then, my dad came fully down the stairs, saw the situation, and immediately took charge. He roared at the man, telling him in no uncertain terms that he did not live here, and that he had to get out immediately. The man stubbornly refused. Seeing no other option, my dad physically grabbed the man, lifted him off the couch, and dragged him toward the side door of the house. He shoved him out into the cold night, and warned him never to show his face here again, before slamming the door shut and locking it. We all stood there, breathing heavily, thinking the nightmare was finally over. But just seconds later, a violent crash shattered the silence. The man had swung his fist and punched directly through the glass window next to the door. Shards of broken glass flew everywhere, scattering across the floor. Then, he pushed his bleeding face right through the broken pane, staring at us with wild eyes, looking exactly like that famous scene from the movie The Shining. While my dad ran to grab the phone to call the police, the man began screaming terrifying threats at us. He kept shouting that he owned the house now, that he knew exactly what all of our faces looked like, and that he was going to come back to get us. We were all in a state of absolute shock and terror. It was hard to process that something so violent and bizarre was happening to us on Christmas night. After a few minutes of screaming, the man finally stumbled away into the darkness. Shortly after, the police arrived at our house and began taking detailed statements from all of us. Since I was the one who had spotted him on the stairs first, my statement took the longest. Fortunately, because it was the middle of winter, it had actually snowed that night. In our part of Scotland, we usually just get wet slush, so having actual fresh snow on the ground was quite rare. And that snow turned out to be the key to finding him. There was a very clear, bright trail of red blood leading right down our street. The police officers followed the bloody tracks easily, and they led them straight to a nearby neighborhood playground. There, lying on the ground in the snow, they found the man. His hands were covered in cuts and embedded with shards of broken glass. They arrested him on the spot and confirmed to us that they believed he was the intruder. The very next morning, we had our broken window replaced. We sat down and explained everything to my younger siblings, who had miraculously slept through the entire chaotic ordeal, probably because they were completely exhausted from all the Christmas excitement and food. Because of my age and the terrifying threats the man had made toward us, I was granted a formal restraining order against him. He was eventually fined for the property damage and sentenced to community service instead of jail time. During his police interrogation, the detectives questioned him about the weeks of mysterious knocking that had occurred before his break-in, but the man swore he knew absolutely nothing about that. He denied ever coming near our house before that night. It turned out that he actually used to live in our house many years before my family had moved in. He claimed that he had no bad intentions whatsoever, saying he had simply had far too much to drink while out celebrating with his friends, and had accidentally walked into his old home by mistake. We were incredibly grateful that nobody in our family was seriously injured. The only actual injury was a bruised wrist that my mom got from slapping him while wearing heavy metal bracelets. It turns out that slapping someone while wearing jewelry hurts you a lot more than it hurts them. But to this day, we have never found any explanation for the strange knocking sounds that plagued our house in the weeks leading up to that night. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes think I hear a faint knock at the door late at night. Sometimes I wonder if it is just my imagination playing tricks on me, or if there really was someone else out there in the dark, watching our house and waiting for the right moment. I suppose I will never truly know the answer. Our next story takes us back to around the year 2010, when I was just a young child of about 6 years old. My family was living in a quiet, cozy neighborhood in the city of Springfield, Oregon. Our household consisted of my mother, my older brother, my older sister, and myself. My dad was not with us at the time because he was deployed overseas with the military. I was extremely close with my dad, and whenever he was away for long stretches of time, it was always very hard on me. One late evening, it was pouring rain outside. My mom went out onto the front porch to have a cigarette, and I decided to sit out there with her to watch the rain fall. Even though it was quite cold and damp, I really enjoyed just sitting there in the quiet, spending that peaceful time with my mother. But as we were watching the rain bounce off the pavement, we noticed something strange. A man was walking right down the middle of our street. What made him stand out immediately was that he was wearing a very bright, oversized yellow rain jacket. It was a striking sight because it was incredibly late at night. The rain was coming down in sheets, and there was absolutely nobody else out on the road. My mom and I both watched him closely. As he got closer to our house, he began to steer his path slightly toward our driveway. My mom immediately stood up, put her cigarette out, and grabbed my hand tightly. We stood there on the porch and watched as the man came to a complete stop right next to the garbage cans at the edge of our driveway. My mom turned around to quickly usher me inside the safety of the house, and that was when the man suddenly began to scream at us. I cannot remember the exact words he was yelling, but I will never forget the absolute terror I felt as my mom hurried me through the front door. The moment we were inside, my mom locked the door shut and immediately turned off all the lights in the house, plunging us in darkness. I was absolutely terrified. Being only 6 years old, I burst into tears. My mom quickly gathered my siblings and me, shushing us gently, and led us all into my parents' large king-sized bed. We all huddled together under the blankets, feeling incredibly anxious and worried about the strange man outside. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing else happened. There was no more yelling, no strange noises, and no signs of the man. Eventually, the warmth of the bed overcame our fear, and we all drifted off to sleep. But that night, I had a horrible, vivid nightmare that I can still picture perfectly to this day. In the dream, I saw a man wearing that same massive yellow rain jacket, standing right outside our bedroom window, peering in at us through the glass. I woke up from the nightmare in a state of pure panic, crying and shaking uncontrollably. I reached over and shook my sister awake, crying as I told her how scared I was. I have no idea what time it actually was. My sister got out of bed and walked me to the master bathroom that was attached directly to the bedroom. She shut the door behind us and sat with me, talking to me in quiet whispers to help calm me down without waking up our mom or brother. But while we were sitting there in the bathroom, a sudden violent noise shattered the quiet. It was a loud, aggressive banging on our front door. My sister gasped, threw the bathroom door open, and ran over to my mom's side of the bed, shaking her awake as fast as she could without saying a word. My brother woke up instantly from the loud noise too. I sat frozen on the bathroom floor, completely terrified, as my mom gestured for my brother and sister to quickly join me inside the bathroom. We all huddled together on the floor, crying and shaking with fear, while the heavy, rhythmic banging on the front door continued to echo through the dark house. My mom went out into the hallway, trying to find her old BlackBerry phone so she could call the police. But in her panic, she could not find it anywhere. That meant we had absolutely no way to call for help. We sat there in the dark bathroom, listening to the man outside. He was not just knocking anymore. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that we let him inside, all while slamming his fists against the door. It was the most helpless, terrifying night of my entire life. It was just my mom and her 3 young children, with no phone, and my dad was thousands of miles away. We huddled close on the bathroom floor, crying and praying that one of our neighbors would hear the commotion and call the police. But nobody did. Eventually, the screaming and banging faded away, and the man left. No police ever showed up. What was so bizarre to us was that our neighborhood was quite small, with the houses built very close together. Our house was actually a duplex, sharing a wall with another family. How not a single neighbor managed to hear a grown man screaming and slamming on a door in the middle of the night was completely beyond us. Eventually, we managed to get back to sleep, and for a few weeks, everything seemed to return to normal, but the peace did not last long. Not even a month later, while it was still just the 5 of us in the house, my family woke up one morning to a chilling sight. Our front door was standing wide open. Not only that, but one of our windows was pushed open, and there was a giant, clean hole cut directly through the window screen. My mom immediately grabbed her phone and called the police. As we went through the house, we realized that several random items were missing. My piggy bank, which contained all of my holiday savings, was gone. Other random household items had been taken as well, but by far the most disturbing thing that was stolen was a large glass vase. For months, our family had been filling this vase with spare cash and coins, saving up for a special occasion, and the absolute most sickening part of it all was where that vase had been sitting. It had been placed right on my nightstand, directly next to the bed where my sister and I had been sleeping soundly all night. The thought that an intruder had stood right next to our sleeping bodies in the dark was absolutely horrifying. Because this happened so long ago, and because my mother has sadly passed away since then, many of the details of the police investigation have been lost to time. My dad was not there when the actual break-in occurred, so he could not fill in the blanks either. We never found out for sure if the intruder was ever officially caught by the authorities. I also still do not know to this day if the aggressive man in the yellow rain jacket was the same person who broke into our home weeks later. It could have been connected, or it could have been a completely different criminal. But there was one strange detail that we noticed later on. A few weeks after the burglary, I happened to look over at the porch of one of our neighbors. He was a quiet man who lived completely alone, and we rarely ever saw him leave his house. But sitting right there on his front porch was a large glass vase that looked identical to the one that had been stolen from my nightstand. We never got proof, and we never knew for sure, but the sight of it always left a lingering, unsettling feeling in my chest. This final story took place about 3 years ago, while I was living in Idaho serving a full-time religious mission. The small town where my companion, whom I will call Spencer, and I were assigned was incredibly small and remote. Because of how quiet the area was, there was not always a lot of work for us to do. To make matters worse, I was going through a really difficult personal patch at the time, struggling with low self-esteem and sleep issues. As a result of all this stress, Spencer and I found it really hard to stay out working all day long, so we spent a lot of time resting at home. We were renting a very tiny house, which was our only real option because there were simply no apartment buildings nearby. The layout of our tiny home was extremely simple. When you walked through the front door, you immediately stepped into the main living room where our desks were set up. To your immediate right was our bedroom door. If you kept walking straight, you would pass through a wide open doorway leading directly into the kitchen. Once you were in the kitchen, the bathroom was on your right, and the laundry room was on your left. It is also important to note that our landlord's house was located right next door, only a short distance away. If we ever ran into any issues, we could easily walk over or give him a quick phone call. On the night this happened, it had gotten dark quite early. Spencer and I were relaxing before going to bed. I was sitting at my desk in the living room, looking at my phone, while Spencer was sitting on his bed in the other room. In the middle of the quiet evening, I suddenly heard a single, distinct knock. It came from the kitchen window right above the sink. Because of our house layout, anyone standing at that kitchen window would have a clear view of the entire living area where I was sitting. I looked up immediately, but all I could see was the pitch black night. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it must have just been a tree branch brushing against the glass. But the more I thought about it, the more unlikely that seemed. None of the tree branches were close enough to touch the window. Just as I was having this thought, another knock sounded. This time, it came from the window in the laundry room around the corner. A heavy feeling of dread settled in my stomach. I called out to Spencer to tell him what I was hearing, but as the words left my mouth, a third knock sounded. It came from the living room window, directly next to where I was sitting. I did not look to see who was on the other side. I bolted from my chair, ran into the bedroom, and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I asked Spencer if he had heard it too, and his wide eyes told me everything. He had. We began to whisper frantically, debating what we should do. The only potential weapons we had in the entire house were a couple of small kitchen knives, and we had no idea how many people were outside, or if they were carrying weapons. Going outside to confront them was completely out of the question. As we were trying to decide on a plan, the knocking sound moved once again. This time it came from the front door itself. The knocks were steady and deliberate, and we were getting more and more terrified by the second. We talked about calling the police, but we were so far out in the middle of nowhere that we knew it would take a very long time for them to reach us. That was when Spencer remembered we had our landlord's phone number. He quickly dialed the number and began explaining the emergency. By this point, the knocking at the front door had stopped, but I knew what was coming next, and I was absolutely dreading it. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the knocks came directly against our bedroom window. Spencer told the landlord what was happening, and the landlord told us to stay exactly where we were. He said he was grabbing his shotgun and would be right over. We waited in total silence for several minutes, holding our breath, but nothing happened. Finally, we heard our landlord's voice calling out to us from the front door. We unlocked the bedroom door and let him in. He told us that as he was walking over, he saw a pickup truck suddenly speed away down the dark road. He said it was already too far away in the dark for him to see any details. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights, and together with our landlord, we went outside to inspect the property. There were still a few small patches of snow left on the ground from a winter storm. In those patches of snow, we found a clear set of footprints circling the entire house, going from window to window. As far as we could tell, there was only one set of tracks. We debated calling the police to report it, but we knew they would have a hard time finding a random truck with no license plate. Our landlord told us to call him immediately if the truck returned, and then he went back to his house. We locked every lock, turned off the lights, and tried to get some sleep, but neither of us could close our eyes. We wondered if it could have been other missionaries playing a mean prank on us, but if it was, they never revealed themselves or said anything afterward. Plus, it was way past our strict curfew. We also wondered if it was local teenagers, but a prank like that is usually done in a group, and we had only found one single set of footprints. We asked around the community over the next few weeks, but nobody ever confessed to doing it. To this day, I still have no idea who was outside our house that night, or why they chose to target us. But the absolute scariest part of the entire experience was realizing that when the very first knock happened at the kitchen window, I had looked directly at that window. That means I was likely staring right into the eyes of the stalker in the dark, and I did not even realize it. From that night on, my sleeping issues only grew much worse, and my personal struggles did not improve. I ended up leaving the area eventually, and I know for a fact that I will never set foot near that tiny house again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We often think of hotel rooms as temporary sanctuaries. They are spaces where we can lock the door, pull the curtains, and completely disconnect from the outside world. But the reality is that a hotel room is never truly private. Dozens of people have keys to your door. The windows might not be as secure as you think, and sometimes the person watching you isn't just a stranger in the hallway. They are already inside. Let's start with a person who used to travel constantly for work. For years, their routine was completely predictable. They would drive for hours, check into whatever cheap but decent hotel was nearby, grab a quick shower, and sleep. They never worried about safety. They never checked the locks twice. To them, a hotel was just a bed and a shower. They had stayed in hundreds of these places, and nothing scary had ever happened to them. They never had any reason to think about danger or weird people hiding in the shadows. But all of that changed during a routine trip they took to a small city in Pennsylvania. It was late afternoon when they checked into a regular-looking hotel that had a small lobby with old, depressing red carpet and a musty smell that reminded them of their grandmother's house. The woman at the front desk gave them a room key, and they went up to their room on the third floor. The hallway was very quiet and felt a little empty in a strange way. The room was pretty normal, with a small bed, a desk, and a bathroom. They threw their bag on the bed, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. They were tired from driving for hours, so after showering and watching TV for a bit, they tried to fall asleep. They woke up in the middle of the night because they heard something sliding on the floor. At first, they thought it was the ice machine or some noise from the hallway. They were half asleep and did not want to get up. But then they heard the soft sliding sound again, and this time it was right by the door. They turned on the lamp and looked at the door. Something small and white was sticking out from underneath. They got up slowly and picked it up. It was a folded piece of paper. There was handwriting inside, very messy and uneven. It was only a few words telling them that someone was watching them from somewhere inside the hotel. Their hearts started beating harder because they had no idea who could have written that. They didn't hear any footsteps after the note appeared, and the hallway had been dead silent. They stood in the middle of their room, feeling unsure if they should open the door or stay inside. They decided to lock the chain lock and sit on the bed with their back against the wall. They kept the lamp on so the room would not be so dark. They felt too awake to sleep now. About 20 minutes passed before they heard the sliding sound again. They stared at the bottom of the door, waiting to see what would happen. Another small piece of paper slid through slowly, like someone was gently pushing it with one finger. They walked up to it and picked it up. The second note said something even stranger. It said that person had been inside the room earlier. It said the person had been inside before they arrived, and they liked watching people sleep in this hotel. The handwriting looked shakier than the first note. They felt a wave of fear go through their chest because the idea that someone had been inside the room was too real to ignore. They looked around, checking under the bed, inside the closet, and behind the shower curtain, even though they already knew it was empty. After checking everything, they sat on the bed again. trying to decide if they should call the front desk. But it was after 2 in the morning, and they had this paranoid feeling that the person sending the notes might be someone who worked at the hotel. The handwriting looked strange and shaky, maybe like an older person or someone who was unstable. They tried to calm down, thinking maybe this was some prank, but it felt too personal. They sat still for another half hour and tried to listen. Every tiny noise made their body tense up. The air conditioner clicking or the pipes tapping made them jump. They told themselves that if a third note came, they would go. They kept their eyes on the door but forced themselves to breathe slowly. After a long period of silence, they started to relax again. But then the third note came. The sliding sound was even slower this time, like the person wanted them to hear it. They walked up to the door again. The third note said something completely different from the first two. It said the person was already inside the room with them again. They stared at the words for a long time. They looked around the room again, slowly turning in a full circle, expecting to see someone in the corner or behind the curtains. They couldn't even breathe normally now. The idea of someone hiding in the room with them made their chest feel tight. They grabbed their bag and made the decision to get out immediately. They went to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. They unlatched the chain lock and opened the door quickly. They rushed out and slammed it behind them, then ran down the hallway, trying to stay quiet, but also wanting to get as far from that room as possible. When they reached the stairs, they looked back only once. At the far end of the hallway, they thought they saw a shadow move behind the corner near the last room. It looked like someone stepping back out of sight. They hurried downstairs to the front desk where a different employee was working. He looked half asleep, but when they told him what happened, he looked extremely confused. He said there were only 3 other guests on their floor, and none of them had been walking around. He offered to give them a new room or let them check out early. They decided to check out early and drive to a different hotel, even though it was after 3 in the morning. Before leaving, they asked if someone could check their room to see if any windows were open or if anything was disturbed. He took them upstairs with a master key, and when they entered the room, everything looked normal, but the window lock was broken in a way that looked recent. The employee looked nervous and said maybe someone from outside had gotten in earlier. They grabbed their bag and left the moment he finished talking. They drove to a different hotel 20 minutes away and barely slept. The next morning, they called the original hotel to see if they had found anything else. They said nothing strange came up. No cameras caught anyone near the room, and no other guests complained. They made it seem like the whole thing was a weird misunderstanding, but they didn't buy it. Something strange was going on, and the broken window lock proved it. The psychological dread did not simply disappear once they checked out and drove away. For months afterward, they struggled to sleep in any room that wasn't their own. The image of that dark shadow quickly stepping back out of sight at the far end of the hallway was burned into their mind. Every time they closed their eyes, they would hear the soft, scraping sound of paper sliding across the carpet. They realized how easily things could have gone differently if they hadn't decided to run when they did. The note was too real. But let's fast forward to another incident that occurred in Virginia during a long drive to visit family. A traveler stayed at a hotel because they were too tired to keep going. It was late at night, almost midnight, and the hotel looked basic but clean. The parking lot had only a few cars, and most of the building was dark. When they walked into the lobby, the man at the front desk barely looked up. He gave them the key, and they went to the 3rd floor. Most of the lights were dim, and every door they passed had a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging like no one wanted to be bothered. It was definitely the type of hotel that people stay at out of necessity. Their room was at the end of the hallway. When they opened the door, the room looked fine, but a little messy. The lamp was tilted, one of the dresser drawers was slightly open, and the blanket on the bed had a small wrinkle near the corner, as if someone had sat there recently. It looked like housekeeping rushed, or simply did not care. They dropped their bag on the chair. They turned on the TV and got ready for bed. They got into bed and tried to sleep, but they kept thinking about how messy the room was. The more they thought about it, the more weird it seemed. They remembered that the front desk man didn't even mention housekeeping when checking them in, and the whole hotel felt too empty. But they forced themselves to ignore it and finally drifted off. They don't know how long they slept, but they woke up to the sound of their doorknob turning slowly. It was such a faint sound at first that they thought maybe the air conditioner made it, but then the handle clicked lightly again, like someone trying to test the lock without waking them. They stared at the door. The room was dark except for the glow from the TV, which they had forgotten to turn off. They could see the shadow of the door handle move slightly. Someone was outside trying to open it. After a few seconds, the handle stopped moving. They stayed still, waiting for another noise. Then the sound came again, but it was different. It was a small metal scraping against the lock. It sounded like someone sliding a key into the keyhole. But that didn't make sense because no one should have a key to their room besides staff. The key turned, but the door never opened. They could see a thin sliver of hallway light in the gap. The door pushed gently once, then stopped. They waited for a voice or footsteps, but there was nothing. Then the door closed softly again, like the person walked away. They stayed awake for almost an hour, listening for footsteps or any sound in the hall. When nothing happened, they convinced themselves it was maybe a staff member who mixed up room numbers, and when they realized, they left. They went to relock the door, then fell asleep again from exhaustion. Fast forward to about 2:15 in the morning, and they remember that specifically. They woke again to something they weren't sure what it was. All they knew was that they heard the slightest rustling sounds in the room, and they knew someone was in there. They were scared to sit up and look, but they did, and then the rustling stopped. They noticed, even in the darkness of the room, the slightest sight of a shadowy figure barely visible in the dark hovering over their bag in the corner of the room. They said in a panicked, shaky voice, asking, "Who is that?" And a deep man's voice responded, telling them it's housekeeping, and that they're sorry and will leave now. They didn't even respond because they were so shook, but they saw the black mass move from their bag to the door, and then the door opened and closed. They immediately flicked on the light and rushed to the door to put on the chain lock. They went to their bag and saw that it had clearly been gone through. They had to gather themselves for a few minutes before calling the front desk. They told them someone with a key just broke into their room and was going through their stuff. The front desk person said that no housekeeping staff was currently there. They packed all their stuff and rushed to the lobby. They called the police and demanded they check the video surveillance footage. When the police arrived, that's when the desk worker agreed to show the surveillance footage, and it showed a large, scary-looking man repeatedly walking down the halls, acting all sketchy, going to their door multiple times, and then finally entering their room with a key. The man at the front desk said that the man didn't work there, and he must have somehow stolen a master key from the hotel. They got their money back and immediately fled, eventually sleeping in their car. This experience permanently ruined their trust in hotels. The police investigation into the Virginia incident was equally frustrating and hollow. The officers took a report, noted the description of the large, sketchy-looking man, and collected the security footage. But the hotel itself faced almost no consequences for their extreme negligence. The fact that a master key had been stolen and was actively being used by a stranger was completely ignored by the staff. But let's look at another terrifying incident that took place in New Jersey. The traveler in this case used to work night shifts for a small delivery company, so on their off days, they would take short weekend trips alone just to get out of the house. During one of these trips, they stayed at a cheap hotel in New Jersey because it was close to a hiking trail they wanted to check out. The hotel wasn't terrible, but it had that old smell, and the hallways were too quiet, like no one else was staying there. They checked in during the early evening, and the woman at the front desk told them housekeeping had already cleaned all the rooms for the night. They didn't think about that detail until later. Their room was on the second floor, and the hallway light flickered when they walked to their door. They didn't pay much mind to how creepy it was, because they were just tired. The room looked clean at first glance. The sheets were tucked in perfectly, but the pillow on the chair looked crooked. They fixed it. They turned on the TV and got in the shower. When they came out, the mirror was foggy, and the room felt colder than before. They got into bed, but they kept noticing a dark corner near the small closet. It made them feel like someone was standing there. They fell asleep, but they woke up after midnight because they heard a strange, soft noise. It sounded like something sliding on the carpet in the corner of the room. They listened closely. Then they heard a quiet breathing sound, not theirs, and it was coming from near the closet. They stayed completely still, terrified. The breathing was slow, like someone trying to stay quiet, but struggling. They slowly pushed themselves up and looked toward the closet. They couldn't see anything at first, but then they noticed the closet door, which they had left wide open, was now slightly closed. The breathing stopped the second they sat up, meaning whatever was in there knew they were awake. They slowly got out of bed and backed up toward the door, keeping eyes on the closet. They opened the door and stepped into the hallway, which was empty and quiet. They went down to the front desk, but no one was there. After a few minutes, the female clerk finally came out of the back room. They told her someone was in their room, but she looked confused. She said housekeeping was gone and no one else had keys except for her and one older housekeeper who left hours ago. She offered to check the room. When they entered, everything looked normal. The closet was wide open again. The pillow was straight, and nothing seemed touched. The clerk checked everywhere and found nothing, suggesting they might have had a nightmare. Feeling embarrassed, they decided to switch to another room down the hall. They moved their stuff quickly and locked the door. It was around 1 in the morning, and they tried to sleep, but they kept listening. After about an hour, they heard the sound of a housekeeping cart rolling down the hallway very slowly. The squeaky wheels stopped right outside their new door. They held their breath. Then they heard heavy, slow breathing right outside the door, sounding exactly like the breathing from the first room. Then came a gentle, soft palm pressing against the door, feeling it rather than knocking. Eventually, the breathing stopped and the cart was pushed away. They sat awake for hours, too scared to move. Early in the morning, they went downstairs to check out. A man was at the desk now, and when they told him what happened, his face went pale. He explained that they had not had a housekeeper on staff for the last week, because the woman who used to work nights had suddenly stopped coming in. He admitted that she still had her keys to all the rooms. The realization was sickening. The person in the room and outside the door was likely the missing employee, who had been living secretly inside the vacant rooms, using her master keys to spy on guests. The hotel's failure to retrieve her keys or change the locks after she stopped showing up was a glaring security breach. Now let's look at another hotel encounter, this time from the perspective of an employee. This person worked as a house person, doing maintenance and helping housekeeping. In the summer of 2023, their boss hired a new front desk worker named Brianna. She worked nights, so they switched schedules to help her. It was a Wednesday night, meaning it was a dead night with almost no check-ins, so they spent the night chatting. The house person went to the pool to restock towels. Employees had master keys to open anything. They unlocked the pool door, went into the storage room, and grabbed a stack of towels. As they bent down, they heard something heavy hit the water. They jumped, dropping the towels, and rushed out to the pool. Floating in the middle of the water was one of the orange lifesavers that was normally mounted on the wall. There was no way it could have fallen in on its own, but the room was completely empty and locked. They fished it out and quickly left, completely weirded out. They asked Brianna if anyone had gone to the pool, and she said no. They didn't want to bring it up and sound crazy, so they kept quiet. Around 9:30, they got a maintenance slip for room 324 because the toilet wasn't working. They went up to the empty room, as the guest wasn't arriving until Friday. They walked into the bathroom, lifted the tank lid, and began working on the valves. While they were working, they felt the temperature in the room suddenly drop to freezing. They stood there, feeling the hairs on their arms rise. It was a warm summer night, so there was no reason for the sudden chill. Just as quickly, the air returned to normal. They checked the thermostat, which read 68 degrees, putting them even more on edge. They went back to work, fixed the toilet, and watched the water rise. But over the sound of the water, they heard an audibly loud thump coming from the bedroom. They froze, and that familiar cold feeling returned. They put the lid back. They put the lid back on the toilet and walked out of the bathroom. They turned to face the beds and saw the room phone on the nightstand dangling by its cord, swinging back and forth. But they weren't paying attention to the phone. They were staring at what was past it. In the corner of the room, right next to the bed, was a remarkably tall person standing completely still. The house person stood frozen in the doorway, struggling to breathe. They couldn't make out any features. It was just a completely black figure in the dim room, standing so still that no sound came from it. Then the figure made a sudden movement. That was all it took. The house person bolted for the door, flung it open, and ran down to the lobby. They told Brianna they were punching out early, said their goodbyes, and left immediately. While driving home, they tried to make sense of what happened, connecting the pool incident to the shadow in the room. They knew it couldn't be a normal human, given how still it stood. They knew it was something else, because they couldn't read a single feature on it. They were just thankful to get out of there safely, and they never experienced anything like that again. All of these stories show us how fragile our sense of security really is when we travel. We walk into a room, turn the lock, and believe we are completely isolated from the world. But the truth is that hotel rooms are transit points, and the security systems holding them together are incredibly easy to bypass. In the first case, a broken window latch allowed a stalker to gain access to a room before the guest even arrived, leaving creepy notes to torment them. In the second case, a criminal with a stolen master key entered a room in the middle of the night, searching through a guest's belongings while they slept. In the third case, a missing employee utilized her retained master keys to live secretly within the hotel, creeping into occupied rooms and moving a housekeeping cart down the hallways in the dead of night. And in the final case, even the employees themselves were subjected to unexplained thumps, freezing drops in temperature, and towering dark silhouettes standing in vacant rooms. These incidents are not just isolated stories of bad luck. They are warnings about the inherent dangers of these shared spaces. When we stay at a hotel, we are putting our lives into the hands of management teams that often fail to secure physical keys, fail to repair basic window latches, and fail to monitor who is walking their hallways. The psychological trauma left behind by these experiences is something that the victims carry with them for years, forever changing the way they travel. They can no longer simply close their eyes and drift off to sleep. Instead, they are left checking the closets, barricading the doors with chairs, and listening closely to every creak and whisper in the hallway. They are left wondering if the lock on their door is truly enough to keep the shadows out. They wonder if they are ever truly alone. We must remember that hotel environments are fundamentally different from our homes. At home, we know exactly who has a copy of the key. We know the history of every lock and window. In a hotel, we are completely dependent on the diligence of strangers. A key card system might seem high-tech, but it is incredibly easy for an employee or an intruder to exploit. Master keys are kept in lock boxes that are often left unlocked, or carried by staff members who might lose track of them. The physical locks on the doors are designed to keep people out, but they are useless if the person outside already has the key. This is why the danger is so silent and so difficult to prevent. The victims in these cases did nothing wrong. They checked in, locked their doors, and went to sleep, just like millions of travelers do every single night. Yet, they found themselves in situations of extreme psychological terror because of simple human error and corporate negligence. The systems failed them. The aftermath of these encounters leaves a haunting reminder that some questions will never be fully answered. Did the Pennsylvania stalker ever return to that room? Or did they find another window to climb through? Did the police in Virginia ever catch the man with the stolen master key? Or is he still wandering through dim hallways late at night, testing door handles? The lack of closure is perhaps the most difficult part for the survivors to process. They are left with the lingering knowledge that their safety was entirely an illusion, and that the spaces they paid to rest in were actually traps. They are forced to live with the fear that it could happen again, at any hotel, in any city, at any time. The quiet corridors that once seemed peaceful now feel cold and threatening. So the next time you find yourself checking into a hotel, no matter how clean or modern it might look, do not simply trust that the lock on the door is enough to protect you. Take a few minutes to check the window latches. Look inside the closet and behind the shower curtain. Slide the security chain into place and consider putting a chair under the handle. Because as these cases show, the division between the safe, quiet space of your room and the dangers of the outside world is incredibly thin. You never truly know who has a key to your door, who has been in your room before you arrived, or who might be hiding in the dark corner right now, waiting for you to fall asleep. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This first story happened back when I was really young, and when I say young, I am talking about the time when I was in either the 2nd or the 3rd grade. It is honestly pretty hard for me to remember things clearly from that long ago, as most of my childhood memories from that period of my life have faded into a sort of general warm blur. But this one particular memory stands out in incredibly sharp, vivid detail, and it does so for reasons that you will very soon understand. It was a typical, ordinary school day in the middle of the week, and it had been raining cats and dogs since the early morning hours before I even woke up. The sky was a dark, heavy, oppressive shade of gray, and the water was pooling in massive puddles all over the school playground, which meant that the teachers had to keep us inside the classroom for recess. After the school bus dropped me off and I walked up our driveway, my parents immediately started getting ready to go out for the evening. They were leaving the house to attend some kind of highly upscale, formal event. I cannot remember now if it was a high society charity fundraiser, a fancy business dinner party, or something else entirely. Either way, they were dressed up in their absolute nicest clothes. My father was wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit with a silk tie, and my mother was wearing a long, sparkling evening gown with her best jewelry. They were supposed to come back home to tuck me in that very night. But while they were gone, the storm decided to pick up like crazy. It turned from a steady, annoying rain into a full-on torrential downpour, and the wind began howling furiously through the tall trees outside our house. It quickly became completely unsafe to drive long distances, especially on the winding, poorly lit and flooded roads that led back to our quiet suburban neighborhood. So, instead of trying to make the highly treacherous drive back home to me, my parents reluctantly decided that the safest option was to spend the night at one of their close friends' houses. This friend happened to live much closer to where the formal event was being held, which made a lot of sense from a logical standpoint. I remember the exact moment the landline phone in our kitchen started ringing. The sound echoed through the quiet house, and I ran over to the counter to answer it. It was my mom on the other end of the line. She sounded incredibly apologetic, and she kept repeatedly saying how sorry she was for leaving me there all by myself in the dark. She sounded genuinely stressed out and worried about the whole situation. Even though I was quite young, I insisted that I was totally fine, that I was not even hungry, and that she did not need to worry about me at all. My mom, trying to calm her own nerves and make sure I would be safe, gave me a very specific, detailed list of things to do before I went to sleep. She told me to go check the front door and the back door to make sure they were locked. She told me to make sure every single window in the entire house was shut tight. She told me to keep at least one light on in the hallway so the house did not look completely dark and empty from the side. And finally, she told me to make sure all the blinds on the windows were fully closed. It was typical, standard safety stuff that any caring parent would tell their young kid. At the time, I did not really understand why they were making such a huge deal out of everything. I was not quite old enough to realize how dangerous it could actually be to leave a kid of my age entirely home alone overnight in the middle of a massive raging storm. In fact, to be completely honest with you, I was actually kind of excited to have the entire place to myself. To a 2nd or 3rd grader, being left alone in the house felt like a massive once-in-a-lifetime adventure. It meant I had completely unlimited access to the kitchen candy drawer, and more importantly, it meant there was absolutely no set bedtime. I obviously did not have a television, a computer, or any kind of screen in my personal bedroom at that age, so I decided to stay downstairs in the family living room. I set myself up on the big comfortable couch, wrapped myself in a warm blanket, and turned on the main television. I told myself that I would do all of those boring safety chores my mom had requested right before I went to sleep, since I was fully planning on staying up all night anyway. I wanted to milk this newfound freedom for everything it was worth. But, as you can probably guess, at some point later in the night, The massive sugar crash from all the candy I had eaten finally got to me. My eyes started getting incredibly heavy, and I accidentally fell fast asleep right there on the couch. There was no real surprise there, as a kid can only stay awake for so long on a diet of pure sugar. I do not remember exactly what time it was when I ended up waking up, but it was definitely very late. It was late enough for the television screen to have gone completely black and entered its automatic power-saving sleep mode, which meant at least 3 hours had passed since I first fell asleep. I distinctly remember feeling a lot colder the very moment I opened my eyes. Now, waking up a bit chilly in the middle of the night is not usually anything too out of the ordinary. I mean, everyone knows that temperatures naturally drop during the late night hours. But this particular difference in temperature was so incredibly significant that it made me instantly make a connection. Even at that young age, the chill in the air felt active and cold, like there was a physical draft moving through the house. I thought about just pulling the blanket over my head, curling back up, and going right back to sleep. But then, like a sudden jolt of electricity, I remembered the list of chores my mom had given me on the phone. Even at that young age, I knew she would somehow find out if I had ignored her strict instructions, and I really, truly did not want to get in trouble after she had trusted me enough to stay home alone. So, with a lot of reluctance, I forced myself off the warm couch and went to go check the windows and doors. I walked through the dark, quiet house, turning on a few light switches to guide my way. I went around and did absolutely everything she had asked me to do. I locked the front door, making sure the heavy metal deadbolt clicked firmly into place. I went to the back kitchen door and slid the lock shut there too. I walked around the entire first floor, closing all the plastic blinds and checking every single window to make sure they were fully secured. I even kept one of the hallway lights turned on, just like she had instructed me to do. Everything was shut tight and locked up, which actually confused me quite a bit. It confused me because the inside of the house still felt way colder than it should have. The chill was persistent and deep. I even went as far as putting my bare hand flat against a couple of the glass window panes, just to make sure they were not cracked open or letting a draft in. But they were all sealed perfectly shut. I figured that maybe the severe storm outside had somehow knocked out the house heating system, or maybe the furnace was just acting up. I did not think much more about it beyond that. That simple explanation seemed to make perfect sense to me at the time, and I was honestly just so incredibly tired that I could not devote any more of my limited energy to thinking about the heating system. So, with my chores finally finished, I headed upstairs to my bedroom, fully ready to crawl into my own bed and forget about the cold. But when I got to the top of the stairs and walked into my room, I finally realized just how bad the storm outside had actually gotten. Our downstairs living room is tucked away in the very center of the house, surrounded by other thick walls. So I had not really been able to fully appreciate the intensity of the weather from down there. But my childhood bedroom, on the other hand, had a very large window that faced directly out toward the front yard. Because of that, I could hear everything in loud, clear detail. The rain was slamming against the glass pane with so much force that it sounded like it was actively trying to break its way inside the room. And every minute or so, there would be a massive, blinding burst of lightning that lit up the entire room like daytime, followed almost instantly by a deafening, house-shaking clash of thunder. I was not typically a kid who was easily scared of storms at that age, but I do remember lying there, feeling a bit concerned that a large tree branch might break off and crash through the roof. That worry is probably why I had such a hard time falling back asleep, even though I had been absolutely dead tired not even 20 minutes prior. As I was lying there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling and trying to force my mind to quiet down, I started picking up on some very odd sounds. Every so often, in the brief silences between the wind howling and the rain hitting the glass, I could hear these weird, slow creaking sounds. It sounded exactly like shifting wood. The major problem with this was that the entire floor of my bedroom, and indeed the entire upstairs hallway, was fully carpeted. There was absolutely no exposed hardwood anywhere near my room, so there was no logical way that creaking sound could have been coming from my floorboards. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just a tree branch outside, swaying in the wind and rubbing against the side of the house. but the quality of the sound did not quite fit that explanation. Even back then, I knew the general, familiar sounds that were associated with a typical thunderstorm. This creaking sound was definitely not one of them. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, and too close. It started really bothering me after a while. For whatever reason, it was no longer the loud storm that was keeping me awake. It was that stupid, persistent creaking sound. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, until I simply could not take it any longer. So, I sat up in my bed and looked around the dark room, not really sure what I was actually looking for. I strained my ears, doing my best to drown out the loud sounds of the storm so I could focus in on where the creaking was coming from. Just then, a bright flash of lightning illuminated the entire room for a split second. Everything looked completely normal. My desk, my toys, my chair, everything was right where it belonged, but my eyes were naturally drawn to the only wooden object in the entire room, my closet. The room went pitch black again, and I sat there in the darkness, perfectly still, barely even daring to breathe. About a minute later, another flash of lightning lit up the room once again. It was only bright for a split second, but in that split second, I saw something that made me freeze and almost choke on my own breath. The closet door, which was made of solid wood and had been firmly shut, was now standing slightly ajar. I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that it had been fully closed before I went to bed. I was 100% sure of it. I always closed my closet door before going to sleep because the dark opening freaked me out. Something had opened it while I was lying in bed. There was something or someone inside my room. I did not scream. I did not speak a single word. I did not even let myself think about what might happen next. I just slid out from under my covers as quietly as I possibly could, placed my bare feet on the carpet, and walked out of the room. That short walk from my bed to the bedroom door felt like a 500-mile journey that took 5 years to complete. Every muscle in my body was tense, expecting a hand to reach out from the dark closet and grab me. But I made it to the hallway. I immediately ran downstairs, trying to make as little noise as possible, and I scrambled under the dining room table. I pulled my knees up to my chest and hid behind the heavy wooden chairs. Then, and only then, did I finally start to cry. I cried silently, tears streaming down my face as I tried to muffle my heavy breathing. I did not know what else to do. There was someone inside my house, someone who had been hiding in my bedroom closet, and my parents were too far away to help me. I had no phone downstairs, no way to call for help, and I was entirely on my own. I am not sure exactly how long I stayed huddled under that dining room table. It felt like hours, but it might have only been 20 minutes. But at one point, above the sound of the rain, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps walking down the wooden stairs. I instantly held my breath, knowing with absolute certainty that any single sound I made could end my life. But these were not normal, steady footsteps. It sounded like whatever was coming down the stairs was stumbling, jumping, and almost pinballing off the walls as it made its way down. The footsteps grew louder and closer. They were moving through the hallway, approaching the dining room. They were coming directly toward the table, almost as if they knew exactly where I was hiding. I cannot even begin to describe how terrified I was in that moment. My heart was beating so hard I was convinced the intruder would hear it. I honestly thought I was going to die, and then, looking out from my hiding spot under the table, I saw them. Because of the hanging tablecloth and the chairs, I could not see their upper body. But 2 bare feet walked directly into my field of view. They were followed by 2 nasty, wet, and incredibly muddy legs that had a strange, sickening yellow tint to them. I could not tell if they were the legs of a man or a woman. That was how gross, dirty, and almost disfigured they looked. There were deep cuts and scratches all over the skin, looking as if this person had just rolled around in a thick, thorny bush. They were also stumbling badly, swaying back and forth, as if they were struggling to even stand upright on their own feet. And just as I thought the situation could not possibly get any worse, the person dropped something. It was a heavy metal wrench. It slipped from their hand and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, rolling a few inches. I am telling you, it took every single fiber of my being, every ounce of strength I had, to fight back a scream. If that person bent down to pick the wrench up, they would have looked directly under the table and seen me hiding there. With wide, terrified eyes, I watched as the person stood perfectly still. They did not bend down to pick up the wrench. But they did not walk away either. They just stood there, swaying slightly. It felt like a tense, silent standoff where any wrong move or sound from me would end my life. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they finally started walking again, moving away from the table until they were out of my sight. I listened closely as those chaotic, stumbling footsteps stomped around the rooms of my first floor for a long time. And then finally, I heard the sound of the front door opening and shutting. They were gone. I stayed hidden under that dining room table for a very long time after the door closed. Part of it was sheer fear, but another part of it was what I can only describe as immediate trauma. I was just completely shaken, numb, and terrified. I was at that ripe age where I fully understood just how dangerous the situation was. But I was not nearly old enough to know how to actually deal with it or process it. The rest of that night is honestly a bit of a blur. At some point, I crawled out from under the table. I saw the heavy metal wrench lying on the floor. I picked it up, not wanting my parents to find it the next morning and ask questions. After making sure the front door was actually locked this time, I slunk back upstairs, crawled into my bed, and somehow fell asleep. Everything went back to normal after that night. For whatever reason, I was absolutely terrified to tell my parents what had happened. I was so afraid that they would find out I had fallen asleep on the couch and had not locked the doors and checked the windows immediately like they had asked me to do. I thought I would get in massive trouble for being irresponsible. So, I kept the entire terrifying experience completely to myself. It was not until several years later, when I was much older, that I finally decided to tell them the story. And to be honest, it actually took a lot of convincing for them to even believe me. They thought I was just making up a wild story or remembering a bad dream. Looking back, my decision to not tell them the very moment it happened was an awful, terrible decision. Since so much time had passed, there was absolutely nothing the police or my parents could do about it. If I am being completely frank, this entire experience traumatized me for basically the rest of my childhood. From that night on, I absolutely had to sleep with a bright nightlight in my room, and I developed a severe fear of the dark that did not go away for a very long time. I still have trouble explaining exactly what happened that night, or who that person was, but I learned a very valuable lesson. Always lock your doors at night. Now, this second story is something that unfolded over the course of about 3 or 4 long years when I was just a young kid growing up in our family home. I cannot remember the exact year or even how old I was when I experienced the very first episode, but I started having this highly specific, recurring, half-lucid nightmare. This was not a dream that occurred every night, but rather once every couple of months, creeping up on me when I least expected it. From what I can still remember with absolute clarity, here is exactly how that dream would go. I would be lying down in my bed, only the view of my room was not from my own first-person perspective. Instead, I would be looking down at myself from the high ceiling, almost as if I were viewing my own bedroom through some kind of security camera feed. That strange, out-of-body dissociation always freaked me out immediately. I would try as hard as I could to float or swim back down toward my own physical body lying below, but I was never able to move at all. The only thing I could do was slowly swivel my head around to look at the rest of my room from that high vantage point. Because I was half lucid, I knew deep down that it was just a dream, but that realization did not make me feel any less scared. After forcing myself to calm down a bit, I would start to notice some very strange, incorrect details about my bedroom. For one thing, the bright red digital clock sitting on my nightstand would always be rapidly counting the time in reverse. That was typically the very first strange detail I would notice. And once I noticed the clock, I would start seeing other weird things. There were these strange, colorful drawings taped to random spots all over my walls and my wooden dresser. They looked like the kind of crayon drawings you would expect from a kid of my age, but I had absolutely no memory of ever drawing them. I was never the type of kid who liked to draw or do arts and crafts, so it was not like I had just made them and forgotten about them. These drawings always depicted the exact same scene. It was a row of stick figure people holding hands, all of them wearing huge, creepy smiles. In the middle of them was one smaller figure, who I can only imagine was supposed to represent me. They were all standing directly in front of a large house that had a bright blue roof. I cannot remember much more about the drawings than that, but they felt deeply unsettling and out of place. The other detail about these dreams that still sticks out to me to this day is an old toy train of mine. In the dream, this toy train was always sitting in a different spot on my bedroom floor. This was highly significant because I had actually lost that exact toy train in real life several years prior, and it had never been found despite my parents searching everywhere. Anyway, after spending a bit of time analyzing my room and noticing these details, I would always get this sudden, unexplainable urge to look out of my bedroom window. I would slowly glance over toward the glass, and as if it were on complete cue, a man would suddenly appear standing just a few inches away from the pane on the outside. He had short gray hair, and there was a very noticeable fresh-looking cut on his left temple. To be honest, that cut is the only detail about his face that I can remember clearly. He would stand there, perfectly still, watching me sleep for a few seconds. Then he would suddenly start clawing frantically at the window glass, scratching his fingernails against it, as if he were trying to force it open from the outside. That clawing sound is usually when I would wake up in a cold sweat. Sometimes, the moment I woke up, I would immediately run over to the window to check. Other times, I was simply too terrified to move a single muscle. But I always ended up checking the window pane one way or another. I do not really know what I expected to find. Maybe some deep claw marks in the wood or a greasy handprint on the glass, but there was never anything there. There was never anyone outside. After this exact dream happened for the 4th time, I finally decided to tell my parents about it. My mom listened patiently and told me that recurring dreams were actually not that rare, especially for kids my age who have active imaginations. My dad chimed in to gently remind me that they were always sleeping just one room down the hallway, and that I could always come get them if I ever felt scared. I nodded my head and acted like their words helped me, but they did not. Not really. My dad could easily tell that I was still feeling incredibly anxious, so he decided to take me by the hand and explore the outside of the house with me. We walked all around the exterior, checking the ground directly underneath my bedroom window. There was absolutely no indication that anyone had ever been standing there. There were no footprints in the dirt, no smudges on the glass, nothing at all. Even so, that did not calm my nerves as much as you might think. Keep in mind, this was about a year into the whole ordeal, so I was having this exact dream roughly once every 3 months. It was not happening every single night, not even close, but having the exact same highly detailed dream 4 times in a row definitely felt like it meant something. I knew that even at my young age. But after that 4th dream and the talk with my parents, the nightmare suddenly stopped. For a while at least. I went nearly 6 whole months without having a single episode. And at some point during that peaceful stretch, I let myself believe that it was finally over. The fear just kind of faded into the background of my mind, the way childhood fears usually do when life gets busy and normal again. But then, without warning, it came back. I have absolutely no idea what triggered it, but on one random night, I had the dream all over again. Everything in the dream was exactly the same as I remembered. The reverse clock, the creepy drawings, the toy train, everything. But there was one new detail about this particular dream that was scaring me twice as much as the earlier ones had. At first, I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Everything seemed to be following the exact same familiar chain of events. But then, as I was looking around the room from my ceiling perspective, I realized what the difference was. My bedroom window was standing wide open. As soon as I saw that open window, I shocked myself awake. But this time, I could not move. There was a period of maybe 5 whole minutes where I was experiencing complete and utter sleep paralysis. My brain was actively screaming at me to get up and check the window, but I could not drag my heavy limbs out of bed no matter how hard I tried. On top of that, I felt significantly colder in real life, as if a stream of freezing night air was actively blowing across my bed from my window, which I was convinced was wide open. Those 5 minutes were unlike any kind of pure fear I have ever experienced in my entire life. All I could think about was how that gray-haired man was probably moments away from climbing through my open window, yet there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop him. When I finally regained control of my body, I forced myself out of bed and rushed to the window. It was closed and locked. I could not fall back asleep for the rest of that night. I was just too terrified. Another couple of months went by, but I was determined not to be caught off guard again. Every single night before I went to bed, I would lie in bed and think long and hard about the dream. I did this in an attempt to brace my mind for having it again. I was hoping that by keeping the dream fresh in my thoughts, I would not get as scared if it happened again. To my surprise, that mental technique actually worked. The next time I had the dream, I was not even half as scared as before. I did not even bother checking the window after I woke up. By the time I had it again after that, I was barely scared at all. Still, something about the dream lingered in my mind. It was not in a scary way anymore, but it was enough to make me want to bring it up to my parents one more time. Maybe it was the way I explained it, or maybe it was because I was slightly older and could articulate things better. But for whatever reason, they actually paid much closer attention this time. I tried to provide as much detail as possible, describing the drawings in the room, but as I got to the description of the gray-haired man, I noticed my parents' demeanor shift. It was not a dramatic change, but it was enough for me to notice. Specifically, it happened right as I was telling them about the distinct cut on his forehead temple. Before I could even finish my sentence, my dad suddenly cut me off. He asked me if I was absolutely sure about the cut on his head. I told him I was completely sure, and he immediately looked over at my mom. They shared this silent, knowing look, like there was some deep, unspoken secret that I was not aware of. I asked them what was going on, but they quickly assured me that everything was fine and that I did not need to worry. Not wanting to upset them, I did not ask any more questions. But from that point on, I started wondering if there was a lot more to this story than they were letting on. As it would turn out, a few days after that conversation, my parents sat me down in the living room. My mom did most of the talking. She explained that when I was really little, way too young to even form memories, there was a man named Brian who used to watch me sometimes. They always referred to him as Uncle Brian, but he was not actually related to us. He was just a very close friend of my dad's from college. I guess he was around our house a lot when I was a baby and a toddler, especially during the times when both of my parents were working full-time jobs. But then, something happened. My dad did not give me any specific details, but he said there was a massive falling out between them. It was bad enough that they completely cut all ties with him. He said he had strictly forbidden Brian from ever coming near our family, and specifically from ever coming near me again. That was supposed to be the end of it. I asked my parents what had caused the major fallout, but they refused to tell me. They just repeated that it had nothing to do with me and that I was safe. But the only other thing they did tell me, and this is what gave me a deep sick feeling in my stomach, was that Brian had a very noticeable scar on his forehead from a serious car accident he had been in, years before I was even born. They did not connect the dots out loud for me, but they did not have to. I was old enough to make the connection myself. Later night, my dad lingered in the living room with me. I could tell he wanted to say more. After a few moments of silence, he told me his personal theory. He said he thought these recurring dreams were just my brain's way of processing a memory that was buried incredibly deep in my subconscious. Some memory from when I was a toddler. He mentioned how close I apparently used to be with Brian, how I would cry whenever he left the house, and how I always wanted him to be the one to read me bedtime stories. My dad said he could not think of any other way I would have known about the specific scar on Brian's forehead. I did not know what to make of that. I had absolutely no conscious memory of this Brian person whatsoever. I had no choice but to try and move on with my life. Another handful of months passed by. The frequency of the dreams actually decreased significantly after that conversation. I only had the dream once or twice over the next year. But things took a very dark turn sometime in the 4th year. One night, after waking up from the familiar dream, I glanced over at my real bedroom window just out of habit. And this time, I actually saw something move in the darkness outside. It was just a brief flicker, but I was 100% sure that someone had just darted away from my window. All the fear I had spent years trying to conquer came rushing back in an instant. I jumped out of bed and screamed for my parents. My dad immediately sprinted outside into the yard in his bare feet, while my mom held me tightly in the hallway. When my dad came back inside, he was whispering to my mom in a very serious tone. They told me to stay in their room while they called the police. I listened to them, though I do not remember ever hearing any sirens that night. The next day, My dad confessed to me that he had found extremely faint footprints in the damp dirt directly underneath my bedroom window. I asked him if he thought it was Brian, but he insisted that was impossible because we had moved to a new house since then, and Brian did not know our new address. My dad promised me that nothing bad was ever going to happen, and he turned out to be right. I never had that dream again. My parents still do not like talking about it, and I can see why. What I still cannot wrap my head around is the sickening thought that maybe, just maybe, every single time I had that dream, there really was someone standing outside my window watching me sleep. Was it really possible that someone had been stalking me for 4 years, and my brain was picking up on it? I still do not know, and I cannot decide which option is scarier. This third story happened a decent while ago, back when I was finishing up middle school. It was the absolute last day of the 8th grade. It was exactly the kind of day you would expect, filled with excitement, high energy, and bittersweet goodbyes. Everyone was running around the hallways, scribbling silly signatures and cheesy messages in each other's brand new yearbooks. My middle school was massive, with easily over 1,000 students in total. So, to keep things organized, the teachers decided to collect all of our yearbooks and pass them around to different classrooms so that everyone got a chance to sign them. You can probably see how that setup could easily create some major problems. Anyone who wanted to could write absolutely anything they wanted in anyone's book without being seen. The teachers tried their best to monitor things, but I knew of several kids who received some really mean, anonymous messages. At the very end of the school day, when I finally got my yearbook back, I flipped through the glossy pages eagerly, reading all the funny notes from my close friends. But as I was scanning the pages, one specific message caught my eye. It was written directly below the portrait of a kid I had never seen before in my life. His name was printed as Samuel Robinson III. The message he had written to me was short, simple, and honestly a bit unsettling. It said, "Hags, I will be seeing you again." I stared at the page, completely confused. I had never spoken a single word to this Samuel kid. I did not even know what grade he was in. But there was nothing I could do about it then, as the school year was officially over. I just chalked it up to some weird kid being strange, or maybe he had signed my book by mistake thinking it belonged to someone else. Either way, I closed the book and stopped thinking about it. A few hours passed, and before I knew it, I was back at my house, hosting a celebratory sleepover in my basement, with my best friends, Kevin, David, and Kieran. The 4 of us were eating snacks, laughing, and playing video games late into the night. My parents' bedroom was located 3 floors above the basement, so we did not have to worry at all about keeping our noise down. We were messing around, having a great time, when suddenly, just before 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard a sharp, loud knock at the basement storm door. The sound instantly silenced the entire room. Who would be knocking on a basement storm door at 2 in the morning? It had to be someone who knew we were down there. The person kept knocking, using a slow, rhythmic pattern. I could tell Kieran was about to say something, and I tried to stop him, but I was too late. In a loud, assertive voice, Kieran yelled out, "Who is there?" I wanted to knock him out right then and there. By shouting, he had basically broadcasted to whoever was outside that we were definitely inside and awake. After a long, tense pause with no more knocking, a muffled voice finally answered back. The voice said, "Come around to the back door." It was a high-pitched voice, and it sounded surprisingly cheerful and friendly, like it was just another kid from school trying to join our sleepover. It was definitely a teenager's voice. I was pretty scared, but my friends seemed completely unfazed. They actually thought it was exciting. They pressured me to go upstairs and check it out. We crept up the basement stairs as quietly as we could. I approached the back door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the narrow glass pane right next to the door, I could see a dark, shadowy figure standing under the dim light of the back porch. I got a little closer, and his face came into view. My jaw nearly hit the floor. It was him. It was the kid from the yearbook, Samuel Robinson III. My friends immediately reached to open the door, but I grabbed their arms and stopped them. I whispered to them that I knew who this kid was, and I quickly explained the weird yearbook signature. That instantly changed their mood. They realized this was not a normal situation. Sam was still standing outside, and he could clearly see us through the glass. He noticed how freaked out I was, and he started motioning with his hand. pointing toward the side of the house, indicating he wanted me to go over to the kitchen window. I did not want to open the back door, but I decided to go over to the kitchen window and crack it open just a tiny bit so I could find out what he wanted. My friend stood just behind me. Sam walked over to the open crack in the window, and I asked him what he wanted, telling him that I knew who he was because of the yearbook. He smiled and said, "Oh, so you got my message." He then went on to say that he had always watched me from afar at school, and that he thought we could have been really good friends. I just nodded and agreed with him, wanting to keep him calm, but there was absolutely zero chance I would ever be friends with him. Before I could say anything else to try and get him to leave, David suddenly leaned forward and called him a creepy stalker, telling him to get lost. Sam's friendly smile disappeared in an instant. He tilted his head slowly, as if he did not understand what David had just said. Then his face twisted into an expression of pure, intense hatred. He went from being quiet and passive to incredibly aggressive. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling about how he hated my friends, how we should all die, and bringing up random, personal details about my life that he had absolutely no right knowing. He reached his hand through the small gap in the window and tried to force it open, but I slammed the window shut and locked it. He started snarling like an animal, banging his fists violently against the glass. He was seconds away from shattering it completely. The noise was so loud that my parents came rushing downstairs to see what was going on. The moment they turned on the outdoor floodlights, Sam turned and sprinted away into the dark yard. I explained everything to my parents and my dad ran outside to search, but Sam was already gone. The next morning, my parents contacted the school administration. That is when we learned the most disturbing detail of all. Sam had actually been expelled from our school several weeks before the year ended, and he was strictly banned from being on school property. The only reason his photo was still in the yearbook was because they had already been printed before his expulsion. That meant he had actively snuck back into the school building on the very last day of class just to find my yearbook and write me that creepy message. Despite my parents and the school working together, nobody could seem to track down Sam or his family. It was like they had completely vanished. To this day, I still have absolutely no idea how he found out where I lived. That is the detail that still keeps me up at night. This fourth story happened a decent while ago, back when I was 22 years old. Enough years have passed now that I feel completely safe talking about it. I was fresh out of college, holding a great new job with very minimal living expenses, because I was living back in my childhood home with my parents. It was a pretty sweet setup, allowing me to save up a massive amount of money while enjoying all the comforts of my hometown. I knew how lucky I was, and I never took it for granted. But not everything during this time was as stress-free as it seemed. What I am about to tell you happened during my very first month of being back at home. I have never been much of a party person. I do not drink heavily, I do not go to clubs, and I definitely do not let random guys dictate how I live my life. My father is the most important role model to me, and I have always preferred a quiet, routine lifestyle. My days consisted of getting coffee, going to work, hitting the gym, reading, and sleeping. But one weekend, my close friend from college, Lindsay, invited me and our other two friends, Sabrina and Thea, to spend a few days at her family's beach house. Lindsay's parents are incredibly wealthy neurosurgeons, so I knew the house would be amazing. And when I arrived, I was absolutely stunned. It was an ultra-modern, massive house that looked more like a secure, high-tech fortress than a beach home. The four of us decided to all sleep in the same room, which had 2 sets of bunk beds, because we thought it would be more fun that way. On our first night there, we wanted to keep things pretty relaxed. We walked down to the private, quiet beach directly behind the house, sat in the sand, and started stargazing while listening to music. As we were sitting there, we noticed a faint flickering light far down the shoreline. We watched as the light swung back and forth, realizing it was a flashlight held by someone walking in our direction. Soon we could hear the sound of laughter, which made us relax a bit. It was a group of 3 guys who looked to be around our age. As they got closer, one of them called out a friendly greeting. Thea, who was always very outgoing, yelled back, and the guys came over to join us. They had the typical beach boy look, and they were very friendly. We sat in the sand, talking and drinking for about an hour. Eventually, the guys invited us back to the house they were staying at just a bit further down the beach. I was feeling exhausted and had no interest in going, but my 3 friends really wanted to keep hanging out. I decided not to be a party pooper, so I told them to go ahead without me, and I walked back to Lindsay's house to go to sleep. Sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning, I was suddenly awoken by my phone ringing. It was a FaceTime call from Lindsay, I answered, and she was screaming into the camera, telling me that Sabrina and Thea had just been kidnapped and that I needed to get into her car immediately. The panic I felt was like ice water in my veins. I sprinted downstairs, grabbed her keys, and drove out of the driveway in a matter of seconds. Lindsay stayed on the phone with me, explaining that she had already called the police. She told me the guys had put the girls into a dark SUV and headed down the main road. I slammed on the gas, driving at an incredibly dangerous speed to try and catch up. After a few minutes, I spotted a vehicle matching her description, driving slowly ahead of me. I kept my distance, called the police to give them our exact location, and followed them. Within minutes, several police cruisers sped past me with their lights flashing. They forced the SUV to pull over, and officers approached the vehicle with their weapons drawn. They dragged the 3 men out of the car, slammed them onto the ground, and put them in handcuffs. One of the officers then rushed to the back of the SUV and popped the trunk open. Inside, both Thea and Sabrina were tied up, terrified, and covered in bruises. The details of what had happened after I left were horrifying. While they were at the guys' house, things had seemed fine at first. But when it was time to leave, one of the guys got incredibly angry when Lindsay refused his advances. She left, but realized she had forgotten her purse and turned back to get it. That is when she witnessed the men violently forcing the other 2 girls into the trunk of their car. If she had not gone back, or if I had not been able to get the car and follow them so quickly, the police might have never caught up to them in time. It turned out those 3 men did not even own the beach house they were staying in. They were actually squatting in a vacant home belonging to an elderly couple who were out of the country. They were charged with kidnapping, burglary, assault, and a list of other serious crimes, and they were sent to prison for a very long time. This 5th story happened just last year, and it involves my best friend Jimmy. Jimmy is highly connected within the electronic music scene on the East Coast, specifically around New York and New Jersey. His company hosts massive music events at high-profile venues, bringing in very famous DJs to perform. Because Jimmy and I have been best friends for over 20 years, he always lets me and our hometown friends come to his shows for free and hang out in the exclusive VIP areas. Last year, over the 4th of July weekend, Jimmy was hosting his biggest event yet at a popular venue right on the Jersey Shore. He invited me and our friend Ryan to come down early, so we made the drive and arrived at the venue several hours before the doors opened. Since we had nothing to do while the crew set up, Ryan and I decided to take full advantage of the free alcohol offered to us. By the time the event officially started, we were already heavily buzzed. As the night went on, we drank even more, eventually becoming completely wasted. As the party was winding down, Ryan and I went over to the bar to get one last drink. While we were standing there, we started talking to 2 attractive girls who introduced themselves as Gianna and Marcella. They seemed very wealthy, based on how they were dressed, and they were incredibly friendly. After a bit of conversation, Marcella suggested that we all leave the crowded venue and continue the party at her beach house, which she claimed was just a short walk away. Ryan and I agreed, and before we left, Gianna handed us each a drink to finish. We downed the drinks and began walking along the beach toward her house. As we walked, I noticed that I was suddenly starting to feel incredibly strange. It was not a normal drunk feeling. My body felt incredibly heavy, like my limbs were turning to cardboard, and I was struggling to keep my balance. But the feeling passed quickly, and we soon arrived at the house. The place was absolutely beautiful, filled with expensive sculptures and modern furniture. Within 15 minutes of getting inside, Ryan and Marcella disappeared into another room, leaving me alone in the living room with Gianna. She leaned in to kiss me, and that exact moment is the last thing I remember before blacking out completely. The next thing I remember is waking up with the hot sun shining directly on my face. I was lying in a patch of thick bushes, feeling incredibly disoriented and sick. When I tried to reach into my pockets for my phone and wallet, I realized they were completely gone. But the weirdest part was that I was not even wearing my own clothes. I was wearing a cheap, dirty t-shirt and shorts that belonged to a complete stranger. My shoes were still on my feet, but the shoelaces had been entirely removed and they were soaking wet. I stood up and looked around, realizing I was in a completely unfamiliar area that did not look like a beach town at all. I walked toward a nearby road and saw a 7-Eleven store across the street. I went inside and asked the cashier if I could use his phone, and I dialed my sister's number. She answered and told me she was actively tracking my phone's location. While I was on the phone, the front door of the store opened, and Ryan walked in. He looked just as confused and messed up as I did, and he was also wearing completely different clothes. We called the police and met them outside the store. We explained what had happened, but they seemed very skeptical, suggesting we had just gotten too drunk and lost our things. My sister then called back to say my phone was showing up in a parking lot just a few minutes away. The officers drove us there, and we found both of our phones sitting on the asphalt. The police refused to investigate any further, telling us to just find a ride home. When I checked my phone, I discovered several text messages had been sent from my number while I was blacked out. They were sent to my parents, Jimmy, and some other friends, letting them know I was safe and sleeping at a buddy's house. The messages sounded exactly like me, which was terrifying because I had absolutely no memory of writing them. Ryan and I later drove back to the beach to try and find the house Marcella had taken us to. We managed to locate it, and we knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, and when we asked if a girl named Marcella lived there, he told us he had lived there alone for 20 years and had no idea who she was. We realized those girls had likely drugged us, taken us to a vacant home, robbed us, changed our clothes for some bizarre reason, and dumped us an hour away. It was a deeply unsettling experience that we will never truly understand. The details of these events still haunt me to this day, leaving behind a deep sense of unease about the world and the people in it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. For about 3 years, a young man worked as an overnight security guard at a local shopping mall. In the beginning, the mall did not require an overnight guard because the area was quiet. However, vandalism became an issue, and the owners decided they needed someone on site during the dark hours. For the most part, his job was simple. He would spend his shift driving around the empty parking lot listening to his car radio. Occasionally, he would kick out some local skateboarders or investigate a suspicious person. But other than those minor occurrences, the job was quiet. That changed about 3 months into his employment. It was the middle of his shift, and he was driving his usual loop around the parking lot. As he looked at the mall, he noticed something unusual. A light was shining from inside one of the retail shops. This was surprising because the mall was locked up, and no one had snuck past him. He decided to investigate. He parked his car, unlocked the entrance, and walked inside. As he approached the shop, he listened closely, but there was only silence. When he reached the store, he saw that the security gate was still pulled down and locked tight. Only the shop owners had keys to those gates, which meant he could not do anything about the light. Figuring it was just a timer issue, he went back to his car. An hour passed with absolutely no activity. He continued his slow drive around the dark parking lot, but as he rounded the corner near the entrance again, he saw another light on inside. He went back into the mall, only to find the exact same scenario. The light inside a completely different shop was on, but the metal security gate was pulled down and locked. He even walked up and tugged on the gate to see if someone had heard him coming and hid. It was locked solid, but just as he turned around, he heard a distinct click from behind him. He spun around. The light in the first shop was now completely dark. He stared into the darkness, and he could swear he saw someone run behind the counter to hide. He had been working on only 3 hours of sleep over the past 48 hours, so he blamed it on his lack of sleep. He shined his flashlight into the dark shop, but saw nothing. He turned around to head back to the entrance, but then he heard another click. He looked back, and the light in the second shop was now off as well. But this time he saw someone standing right there in the darkness of the shop. He decided to call out, saying they could either leave with him right now, or they could leave with the police. The figure did not move, They just stood there silently, right next to the wall-mounted light switch. He walked toward the gate, aiming his flashlight directly at the switch. But when the beam hit the wall, there was no one there. He noticed a clothes rack standing very close to the switch, so he figured the light was just catching the clothes right and casting a shadow. He left the mall, feeling spooked, but over the next few months, the incident faded from his mind. About a year later, he experienced something even more bizarre. It was the dead of winter, and he was inside the mall checking the water pipes. Even though he was a security guard, the owners liked to save money by having him do basic maintenance checks. It was late, around 4 in the morning. He went toward one of the bathrooms to use the toilet. Just as he approached, he heard a toilet flush inside. It startled him, but he figured someone was in there. When he walked inside, the bathroom was completely empty. These toilets were motion activated, so he checked every single stall to see if someone was hiding. They were vacant. He decided to use one of the stalls himself. As he sat there, he pulled out his phone and started watching a video to pass the time. Suddenly, he heard a strange tapping sound coming from the stall right next to him. He glanced down to his left, and his heart skipped a beat. There was a pair of shoes standing on the floor, with the toes pointed directly toward his stall. He slowly looked up, letting his eyes travel up the gap between the stalls, and then he froze. Standing in the next stall was the tallest man he had ever seen, leaning over the partition and staring straight down at him. The man had an intent, unblinking gaze. As soon as the man realized he had been spotted, he ducked back down out of sight. Terrified, the guard jumped up, kicked open the door to the neighboring stall, but there was no one inside. The only thing in the stall was a pair of empty shoes, sitting in the exact spot where he had seen them. He did not wait around. He ran out to his car, completely shaken, and went home after his shift. Our second story takes us to the infamous, abandoned Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio. A teenager and his friend, whom we will call Jake for privacy reasons, decided to explore the massive decaying structure. It was around 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and because they did not have school the following day, they thought it would be the perfect time for an adventure. They managed to find a door that had been jammed open by previous visitors and slipped inside. The interior of the mall was completely pitch black. For a few moments, they turned off their flashlights just to experience how dark it really was. They turned their lights back on and began exploring the lower level, eventually making their way up to the second floor by climbing up a broken escalator. As they walked along the upper level, shining their flashlights into the empty, closed-off stores, they heard a loud bang echo from further down the corridor. The teenager immediately panicked and asked Jake if he thought it could be security or the police patrolling the area. Jake doubted it, suggesting it was probably just other people exploring the place. Still, they decided to be safe and began walking in the opposite direction of the sound. They were right near the old J. Penny store when they heard another loud bang, much closer this time. They immediately switched off their flashlights so they would not be spotted. Moving in total darkness, they did their best to put some distance between themselves and the noise, trying hard not to bump into walls or trip over anything. As they crept forward, the teenager heard a quiet whispering sound coming from just a few feet ahead of him. It was a muffled sound, and he assumed it was Jake trying to call him forward in the pitch blackness. He kept moving toward the sound. When he got close enough, he whispered into the dark, asking where they should go next. There was no answer. He reached out with his hand, feeling around in the dark, and his fingers brushed against a shoulder. But as he felt the fabric of the jacket, he realized it felt completely different from the smooth coat he knew Jake was wearing. He quickly switched his flashlight on, and what he saw made him scream in pure terror. The person he was holding onto was not Jake. It was a tall man wearing a beanie and a face mask. Before he could react, the man lunged forward, grabbed him, and put him into a tight headlock, starting to drag him backward into the darkness. The teenager struggled, but the man was too strong. Just then, Jake sprang out from the darkness and landed a clean punch right to the man's face. The blow stunned the attacker, causing him to loosen his grip just enough for the teenager to break free. Both boys did not hesitate. They turned and sprinted as fast as they could, back toward the broken door where they had entered. They burst out into the night air and kept running until they reached their car. Jake started the engine, slammed on the gas, and tore out of the abandoned parking lot. It was only then that they finally felt safe. Our final story took place in South Carolina, where another young person worked at a 24-hour general store located inside an active shopping mall. Even though the mall itself would close its doors to the public at 9:30 in the evening, the general store remained open all night long. Because of this setup, the store had two separate entrances. There was one entrance that connected directly to the inside of the mall, and a back door that customers could use to enter from the parking lot after hours. Every night at 9:30, the employee had to slide a metal gate closed to block off the store from the dark mall hallway. Because the store was quite small, the late night hours were usually very quiet and peaceful, with almost no customers. One night, during the middle of a shift, the metal gate was down, but the employee could still see clearly through the slats into the dimly lit corridor of the closed mall. The mall kept a few dim night lights on, so the security guards could monitor the cameras, as the employee was organizing the shelves and making sure everything was neat. A loud, metallic rattling sound broke the silence. He looked over at the metal gate and saw a man standing on the other side, holding onto the metal bars with both hands. The employee assumed it must be a security guard making his rounds, even though it was very rare to see them walking the floors at night. He walked over to the gate to ask if there was a problem. As he got closer, he realized this was definitely not a security guard. It was a strange man wearing a dirty black and white plaid shirt and baggy blue jeans. What was most disturbing was that he was just staring directly up at the ceiling. The employee asked again if something was wrong, but the man ignored him, shaking the gate while looking up. The employee did not know how to call security, so he decided to walk back to the register. He watched as the man backed away into the dark mall, walking backward with his head still tilted up toward the ceiling. A little while later, a customer entered through the back door. The employee was sweeping and could not see them, but when he returned to the register, he saw the man standing in the alcohol aisle, looking up. The employee bent down to put the broom away, but when he stood up, his heart stopped. The man was staring at him with a wide, terrifying smile. It was the same man, but his plaid shirt was gone. The two stood staring at each other. The employee, frozen in fear, managed to yell at the man to get out. The man did not move. Terrified, the employee ran to the back room, locked the door, and tried to call his manager, but she did not answer. As he sat there shaking, he heard a gentle tap at the door. He stayed locked inside for 5 minutes before finally stepping back out. Fortunately, the man was gone. The employee showed the camera footage to his manager, who was shocked. He quit a month later. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We think of police officers as authority figures, the ones who have control over every situation. But when they get called out to a scene in the dead of night, they have no idea what is actually waiting for them. They step into dark alleys, abandoned buildings, and thick woods, completely blind to the dangers lurking in the shadows. Today, we are sharing 4 haunting stories from former police officers who walked into routine calls only to come face to face with things that defied explanation. Our first story takes us to Floyd County, Georgia. Imagine being a police officer patrolling the quiet dirt roads late at night. For this officer, it was just another slow shift. The kind of night where the minutes feel like hours, and the only sound is the hum of your patrol car engine. The dirt roads in this area are flanked by dense, suffocating woods on both sides. There are no streetlights out here, just the high beams of your cruiser cutting through the pitch black. And then, as the officer was slowly driving down one of these isolated roads, he saw a sudden flash of movement. Right on the left side of the road, a figure suddenly leaped from the shoulder directly into the thick trees. It happened so fast that the officer only caught a glimpse of the person's lower half before they vanished into the darkness. The officer stopped his car. He turned the vehicle slightly to angle his spotlight directly into the spot where the person had disappeared. He stared into the trees, but the woods were too dense. He could not see anything. Now, most people would probably keep driving, but the problem was, it was this officer's job to investigate. He could not just leave it alone. So, with a heavy feeling of unease in his chest, he put the car in park and stepped out into the cool night air. the woods were dead silent. The officer reached down and put his hand on his holster, ready to pull his gun at a moment's notice. He began walking slowly toward the tree line, his flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks. At this point, the tension was incredibly high, and then the classic sound of a dry branch snapping echoed from behind a large oak tree. The sound was so close and so sudden that the officer almost bolted back to his car, but instead he took a deep breath, stood his ground, and yelled out into the darkness, ordering the person to step out into the light. To his surprise, a figure slowly stepped out from behind the tree. But what made the officer freeze was what this person was wearing. They had a strange, creepy mask covering their entire face. The officer immediately drew his weapon and pointed it at the masked figure. He yelled out, ordering them to raise their hands, take off the mask, and step forward slowly. The figure complied with the first part. They slowly raised both hands into the air, but they refused to take off the mask. They just stood there, staring at the officer through the eye holes. The officer, trying to assert his authority, raised his voice even louder, demanding that they remove the mask immediately. The figure looked as if they were about to reach up and pull the mask off. But then, they suddenly paused. They glanced quickly to their left, and then looked right back at the officer. In that exact moment, the officer heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps rustling through the dry leaves to his right. He swung his gun over, his heart hammering against his ribs. He yelled out as loud as he could, commanding everyone in the woods to show themselves with their hands up. He was absolutely terrified. And then, another figure stepped out from the darkness. This person was also wearing a mask. But the problem was, this second person was holding a large, heavy axe in their hand. Before the officer could even process this, more rustling sounds began echoing from every single direction around him. Footsteps were coming from the left, the right, and from deep behind the trees. The officer spun around in a panic, trying to track the movement. Within seconds, he was completely surrounded. There were at least 10 strangers, all wearing different masks, standing in a large circle around him. The only opening left was a narrow path directly behind him, leading back to his patrol car. Half of these masked individuals were holding axes, pipes, and other weapons. The officer stood there, his gun raised, but he was completely paralyzed. There were too many of them. If he fired a shot, he knew they would overwhelm him in seconds. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The silence in the woods was deafening, and then one of the masked figures finally broke the silence. In a deep, muffled voice, the figure simply said, "Go away." The officer did not say another word. He did not try to make an arrest. He turned around, sprinted as fast as his legs could carry him back to his cruiser, jumped inside and slammed the door. He locked the doors, put the car in drive, and sped down the dirt road at high speed. As he drove, his hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold the steering wheel. He grabbed his radio and called for every available unit to back up his position. A short time later, a massive search squad arrived at the scene. They flooded the woods with powerful lights and search dogs. But by the time they got there, the entire group was gone. There was no trace of the masked figures left behind. The officer would later develop a chilling theory about what happened that night. He believed that he had stumbled upon some kind of secret, dangerous group that was setting a trap for an innocent, unsuspecting driver. They were likely planning to block the road or lure a passerby into the woods to do something unspeakable to them. But because the officer happened to be driving a marked patrol car, the scout who jumped into the woods tried to hide, not realizing the officer had already seen him. If he had been driving a regular civilian car, he believed he would have been lured into those woods, and he might have never been seen again. Our second story takes us to a small, quiet village. A former officer recalls responding to a call about some suspicious noises coming from an old, abandoned 2-story convenience store. When the officer arrived, the building was completely stripped empty. He began his search on the first floor, checking every single empty aisle for anyone hiding in the darkness, but found nothing. He then went upstairs and checked the second floor, which was also completely empty. Believing the noises were just the wind, he headed back to his car, but as he looked back at the second floor window, he froze. A woman with long gray hair was staring straight down at him with a wide, disturbing smile. The officer immediately ran back inside and made it upstairs in less than 10 seconds, but the window was completely clear. He searched all 3 aisles 10 times, checked behind the counter and in the bathroom, but found no one. He figured his mind was playing tricks on him and walked back out. When he looked back at the window, there she was again, wearing the exact same mockingly creepy smile. Rattled, the officer charged back upstairs and began running around the aisles trying to find her. He was about to give up when something caught his eye on the ceiling. He shined his flashlight upward, and his heart stopped. The woman was clinging flat to the ceiling like a spider, holding onto 2 metal hooks with her hands, while her feet were pressed against the ceiling tiles for support. She was staring directly down at him with that same terrifying smile. The officer arrested her and took her to the station. The entire ride, she stared at him through the mirror with that same unblinking smile. He never knew if she had a mental disability or was just playing a sick game, but her stunt was something he would never forget. Our third story involves 2 officers responding to a commercial motion sensor alarm at a newly converted doctor's office. When they arrived, a man claiming to be the key holder met them. Since the stairwell door was locked, he suggested they take the elevator to the 2nd floor. When the doors opened, they stepped into a pitch-black hallway with a single light bulb at the far end. They checked the doors, finding all locked except for the last office. They entered and cleared the empty exam rooms. But when they stepped back into the hallway, they noticed something strange. The light that had been on was now dark, replaced by a light near the elevator. Even worse, all the office doors they had just confirmed were locked were now standing wide open. Suddenly, the main door slammed shut with force and their radios erupted with deafening static. Terrified, they rode the elevator back to the lobby, but the keyholder was gone. The officer radioed dispatch for the keyholder's phone number. The dispatcher responded that the keyholder was still 5 minutes away and had not arrived yet. When the real keyholder, a woman, finally arrived, she listened to the description of the man who had let them in. She went pale and explained that the description matched one of the doctors who used to lease that office, but he had committed suicide at his summer home several days prior. Our fourth and final story comes from a veteran officer who retired at 50 after 30 years of service. One night, he and his partner Steve responded to a domestic abuse call made by a neighbor. They arrived at the house to find the front door wide open and a powerful scent of marijuana and manufacturing chemicals filling the air. Hearing a loud thump from upstairs, they slowly made their way up. They found a closed door, and when they pushed it open, they were met with the sickening smell of human decay. In the dim light, they saw a heavily decomposed female body lying on the bed. Leaving Steve to secure the room, the officer searched the rest of the house. He approached a tiny windowless room with only a dirty old cot inside. Finding it empty, he was about to turn around when Steve let out a terrifying scream. The officer rushed back and saw a shirtless, wild-eyed man lying flat on top of a tall dresser, trying to press himself against the ceiling. Before they could arrest him, a hand reached out from under the bed and grabbed the officer's ankle, trying to pull him down. The officer stomped on the arm, pulling out a frail, drug-addled woman. They handcuffed both of them and began leading them out. Suddenly, a third man burst from an attic door, charging down the stairs with a raised knife. Steve reacted in a split second, shooting the attacker dead just 2 seconds before he could strike. It turned out the house was an active crack house, and the deceased woman on the bed had been killed by the shirtless man over drug money. The man was sentenced to life without parole, and the woman received 30 years. Steve never regretted his actions, knowing he had saved his partner's life and removed a dangerous threat from the world. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I was working the night shift at my local Waldbaum supermarket back when it was open 24 hours a day. On a normal night, I would see less than 10 customers throughout my entire shift. But that did not mean I could just sit around and do nothing. The managers wanted me to work on stocking the shelves whenever I was not helping someone at the register. It was a pretty large store, so there was usually one other person in the building with me. Sometimes it was another stock boy, or maybe a night janitor cleaning the floors. But on this particular night, I was completely alone. I was working on stocking a shipment in the cereal aisle. That was when I heard something heavy fall over on the other side of the shelf in the next aisle. Normally, I would always hear the front sliding doors of the store open. They were incredibly loud, and the sound always echoed throughout the empty building. So, hearing something fall without hearing the doors open first really caught me off guard. It made me realize that there might have been a customer in the building that I had not noticed. At first, it did not seem too weird, but then I looked to my left. Standing right at the edge of the aisle was a man. He was just standing there, completely still, staring at me with a blank expression on his face. I felt a bit nervous, so I asked him if he needed some help finding something. The man took a second to respond. He slowly asked me if I could point him in the direction of the eggs. When I looked at his face, I noticed something was off. He did not look normal. His upper lip protruded quite a bit, almost like a cartoon character. It made me feel extremely uncomfortable, and I really did not want to be the one to ring him up at the register. I quickly finished stocking the cereal boxes and decided to bring my heavy metal stock cart back to the storage room. But as I was pushing the cart, the same man suddenly cut me off. He came through the middle section of the aisle and stood right in front of me. I would estimate this guy was in his mid-30s. I was only 22 at the time, but I looked a lot younger. The man stopped me and started trying to make really awkward small talk. He began by asking me what my name was. Then he asked how old I was, if I went to school anywhere nearby, and why I was doing the night shift. His questions started to get weirder when he asked me if I went to parties a lot, and if I had a girlfriend. I told him I did not, and then he asked me if I had ever had a boyfriend while putting his hand on my shoulder. I immediately started walking away with the cart, but he followed me. I told him I was not into whatever he was thinking about. I went faster and faster until I finally made it to the back storage room. He did not follow me in. I knew I was not supposed to stay back there for extended periods of time to avoid customer theft. So I decided it would be best to just wait for him by the register so that he would ring his stuff up and leave. But I waited there for at least 20 minutes, and he never came. I decided he was gone, and whether he stole the eggs or something else, there was not anything I could do now. I had to go to the bathroom, so I took a quick jog to the back of the store and into the employee bathroom. Moments after sitting on the toilet, my heart dropped into my stomach as I heard the bathroom door open. I choked the urge to say something like, "You cannot be in here," but I did not want to give away my position. I lifted my legs so that I would not be visible from under the stall, and what happened next was simply horrifying. I sat there for the longest time looking at the floor, not moving a muscle. When I finally looked up, I could see an eye peering through the crack of the stall door. I screamed. I knew I was trapped, and I knew I had one shot at making a move. I grabbed the box cutter in my pocket and began sliding it through the crack of the door, forcing him to move his eye away. I took that chance to slam the stall door open in his face and run out of the bathroom and all the way out of the store. I called my boss at least 5 times before he finally picked up and explained everything. He told me to call the cops, and so I did. Of course, the man was not in the store anymore by the time the cops showed up. I only did the night shift twice after that, and luckily did not see the man again. And then, there was another night shift job at a gas station on the side of some highway in the country. My shift was from midnight to 6 in the morning, and the road was pretty dead. I would have maybe 1 or 2 people come in to pay cash in a whole night. It was a very boring and depressing job, especially doing the graveyard shift, but I had just finished college and I needed to pay off my loans. The only reason I kept this job was because my boss threw me an extra $5 an hour for doing the night shift. On this one cold December night, I was doing my usual thing, reading the newspaper, playing games on my phone, and whatnot, when I noticed the headlights of a car pulling off the highway into the parking lot. It was a red pickup truck. Somebody stepped out and shut the door. I went back to reading the paper as I saw that he was standing by the gas pump. I assumed he was not paying cash. I looked up a few moments later and saw that he was still standing in the same position, staring at the gas pump. He was obviously confused, so I felt like I should go out and help him. But then, a cold chill ran up my spine. The tall man slowly turned his head to face me. I could not make out any features of his face, but I knew he was staring at me. I tried to pretend I did not notice by going back to reading the paper. Of course, I was not really reading now. I was a bit shaken by the guy out there, and I just wanted him to pay debit or credit and leave. I looked up and gasped as the man was now much closer to the front door of the building. It would not have been so disturbing if it were not for the fact that he was not moving. He was just standing still as before, still looking in my direction. I walked over to the door to get a closer look. All I could see in his face was still blackness. I locked the door and flipped the open sign to closed. I did not care if this would possibly get me in trouble, as I was not taking a chance because I was scared. I walked back behind the counter and sat down on one of the containers on the floor, just so I could not see the man outside anymore. I stayed in that position for a good 5 minutes, texting every friend I have to see who was awake. I was desperate to tell somebody about this. When I finally got up to check that he was gone, I let out a full scream as the man was now right outside the door, pressing his dark face against the glass. I picked up the phone on the counter and called the police. The operator was reluctant to send somebody over because of the way I described the situation, but I persuaded them. I hid behind the counter, balled up like a child. I began to hear heavy thumps at the door. These were not innocent knocks to catch my attention, but thuds and thumps trying to break down the door. And then eventually, it finally stopped. I heard the sound of a car starting outside and then driving off. I looked outside and he was gone. A patrol cop along with a state trooper pulled into the parking lot. I reported the red pickup truck and told them which direction I thought he went in. I could not describe his face as all I saw was blackness. Of course, there was not much the police could do, as the man did not really do anything. I left that job a few months later to a job in the city. Fast forward to another incident that happened to me. 2 years ago, I was called in to do the night shift from 10 in the evening to 4 in the morning at 7-Eleven since somebody called out. The store was located on a busy road in a rather quiet and rural area. During the night shift, you could expect anywhere from 10 to 20 people to come in to buy a beer or something else. This one particular night, there was this one guy in his mid-20s that came in. He started making weird noises, like loud yelling noises. I assumed he had some kind of mental disability. In fact, my brother has a mental disability, so I immediately felt sympathy for the guy. He walked up to the counter without any items, with his head facing me, but his eyes were looking up at the ceiling. I felt uncomfortable, and I honestly did not know how to deal with it. I tried speaking with him, but he only responded in loud noises. I kept checking if he was with someone outside, but he was alone. There were not any cars in the parking lot, so I assumed he walked. He stood there for so long looking up at the ceiling and making noises that I tried to get him out by handing him a bag of chips and telling him he can go. I tried finding some kind of number to call for someone to help him, but then out of nowhere, he finally turned around and walked out of the store. I felt so horrible for the man, but at the same time I felt a bit creeped out. About an hour later, the phone on the counter rang. I picked up to hear the familiar yelling sounds of the man from earlier. It caught me off guard, and I did not know what to think, other than this has to be some kind of prank. I hung up on them and was now becoming paranoid of my surroundings, constantly checking the outside through the windows. Come 4 o'clock, the person working after me came in, finally allowing for me to go home. It was not my problem anymore. I got home and threw all my stuff on the table, ready to get to sleep, but my phone rang within a minute after entering the door. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would someone be calling at 4 in the morning? I could only imagine it was bad news. I braced myself and picked up the phone to hear the man again. I felt sick to my stomach as I listened to the loud noises he made. I struggled to slam the phone to the receiver. All night, I felt like I was being watched, even with all the blinds shut, and I could swear I heard strange noises coming from all over my house. I refused to get any sleep until the sun came up. Weeks passed, and I had forgotten about the incident until one day when going into the basement for the first time in a while, I found that papers had been scattered all over the floor. When I went into the basement closet, I found writing on the walls. 7-Eleven had been written in Sharpie on the wall, along with the address to the 7-Eleven I worked at, and my house address. The most disturbing part was that I also found various kitchen knives along with a large pocket knife sitting in the closet. What started out as seemingly just an innocent person turning into something of a prank ultimately turned into something much more horrifying. He had been living down there for God knows how long, and I am just grateful that for whatever reason, he changed his mind and left, because I have not seen or heard from him since. All I can say is that man is dangerously ill. I worked in the canine unit for 9 years, and I will never forget this one night. I was working with my patrol dog, Sammy. She was a German Shepherd, still new to the job. I was driving down a road when I spotted a white van parked in the crops. Both doors were open. I flashed my lights, but nobody came out, so I parked and scanned the area. Seeing no one, I took Sammy with me to track the driver. Sammy started going crazy when we reached the back of the van, pulling hard on her leash. I opened the trunk, and a blast of foul air hit me. I almost passed out from the smell and the shock. Inside the trunk, I saw 7 body bags, each with a pair of feet sticking out at the bottom. I radioed for backup immediately. Just then, I heard a twig snap nearby, and Sammy broke free from her leash and ran into the crops. I pulled my gun and followed her, barking. Suddenly, Sammy stopped barking, but I heard movement in all directions. Out of nowhere, 2 arms wrapped around my throat. I could not breathe. Then I heard Sammy bark, followed by a scream as she bit the man's leg. I turned and pulled the trigger, killing him. I grabbed Sammy and ran back to my car. I could hear people chasing us, but I managed to drive away. Backup arrived, but the van was gone, and I failed to get the plate number. I let a van full of killers get away. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine being a single mother of 2, balancing a busy life, and sharing custody of your kids with your ex-husband. Every single month, you rotate. One month, you are completely alone in a quiet house, and the next, your home is filled with your children. For this mother, her 15-year-old son, Luke, and her 10-year-old daughter, Melissa, were her entire world. Whenever it was her turn to have the kids, she would go completely overboard at the grocery store. She wanted the pantry overflowing and the fridge packed to the brim. But on the months she was alone, she was the complete opposite, barely keeping anything in the house. One Friday night just a few months ago, she decided to do some late-night grocery shopping. Earlier that afternoon, Luke had texted her, asking to go out with his friends. Since it was a Friday night, she wanted him to have some fun, but she was not thrilled about leaving 10-year-old Melissa home alone. Still, she knew she could not expect Luke to babysit forever, so she agreed. She got back around 9 o'clock. Because she had bought so many groceries, she had to make 4 separate trips from her car to the house. When she finally finished putting all the groceries away, she went upstairs to greet Melissa. She heard the shower running, so she assumed Melissa was washing up. She went back downstairs to lay down in the living room and put on a show on Netflix. But halfway through the episode, she still had not heard Melissa leave the bathroom. Long hot showers are not cheap, and she never condoned her kids wasting water. She went up to knock on the door and tell Melissa to get out soon, then returned downstairs. Another 5 minutes passed, and the water was still running. She went back up and knocked louder. She waited for her daughter to acknowledge her, but when she did not, she began to knock harder and yell her name angrily. That was when she noticed through the bottom crack of the door that the light inside was completely off. The room was dark, but the water was running full blast. She tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. She easily unlocked it with her fingernail and forced her way in. She stepped into the dark room, yelling her daughter's name. She flicked the light switch up, walked to the tub, and yanked the curtain half open. Not in her worst nightmare would she have expected to find what was lying there. Flat in the bathtub was a withered, 50-something woman, fully clothed, with the shower spraying water directly onto her. The mother screamed so loud, she lost her ability to scream for a few seconds. She backed up against the mirror, knocking everything off the counter. The strange woman stood up in the tub, her long graying hair and clothes completely drenched. The mother slammed the bathroom door shut, ran to Melissa's room, and found her hiding under the covers. She grabbed her and ran toward the stairs. As they passed the bathroom, the door had been pushed open, and that woman was standing in the doorway like a zombie. The mother grabbed her phone, ran to the basement with Melissa, and locked them in a room. The police arrived quickly in a timely manner, but the woman was already gone. While they waited, Melissa explained that she had heard someone enter the house. But when she saw a random scary woman walking up the stairs, she ran to her room to hide. Luke had left the front door unlocked. She had simply slipped out of the unlocked house. The mother believed she was heavily drugged. Given her zombie-like state, she was never found. It was a terrifying lesson to always lock your doors. Now, sometimes danger does not come to your home. Sometimes it waits for you on a family vacation, a place where you are supposed to feel completely safe. This next story happened over 15 years ago. A family went to a popular resort in New York State with their 2 kids, who were 4 and 6 at the time. This story focuses on their 6-year-old son, Michael Jr. They were on vacation around Easter, so the resort had set up fun activities, including a person walking around in a large professional Easter Bunny costume. One evening, while they were in the dining hall, the Easter Bunny was walking around giving kids high fives. When he came over to their table, their 4-year-old son Peter hid under the table crying, but Michael Jr. happily gave him a high five. The bunny mascot walked away quickly to prevent Peter from crying further. The next day, there was an Easter egg hunt in a field near the children's center. The mother watched the kids collect eggs, while her husband was elsewhere. The Easter Bunny mascot was walking around the field. She noticed he seemed to remember Peter's fear and kept his distance, but he was interacting with Michael Jr. a lot. It seemed harmless, but she did not want Peter to get upset, so she took Peter to the other side of the play area. When it looked like the bunny was gone, she walked back to where Michael Jr. had been, but he was nowhere to be seen. She began calling his name in a panic. Another parent approached her and asked if she was looking for a boy wearing a red sweater. The mother said yes. The parent told her that the Easter Bunny had just walked him out of the field toward the parking lots. The mother picked up Peter and ran as fast as she could. Motherly instincts and a rush of adrenaline pushed her forward. As she reached the parking lot, she saw the person in the Easter Bunny costume, holding her child's hand, approaching a parked black car. She screamed at the top of her lungs for him to get away from her son, and screamed Michael's name. They turned, and the man let go of her son's hand. Michael ran to her, completely unaware of the danger. The man in the costume claimed he was just trying to help the boy find his mother because he looked lost, but it was a lie. He was about to put him in his car. She lunged forward and tried to yank the rabbit mask off his head to see his face, but he was too quick. He violently shoved her to the ground, yelling at her to back off, before getting into his vehicle and speeding out of the parking lot. She desperately tried to read his license plate number, but the car was already too far away. They went to the front desk, and the resort told them they did not employ anyone to wear an Easter Bunny costume that day. The man was an absolute predator. There are times when the danger does not come from a physical intruder or a predator hiding in plain sight. Sometimes, the threat is something far more mysterious, something that cannot be easily explained by modern science or logic. This was the case for a young couple who had adopted a son named Charlie. They had adopted Charlie when he was just 2 years old. Because they wanted to be completely honest with him, they told him about his adoption as soon as he was old enough to understand and speak. Charlie was now 7 years old, a happy and active young boy. The couple had no other children, as the wife was unable to have biological kids, so Charlie was the center of their universe. The family lived in a spacious 2-story house with 2 extra bedrooms upstairs. They decided to turn one of those spare rooms into a massive playroom for Charlie. It was a child's paradise, filled with a Lego table, action figures, toy chests, and a large walk-in toy closet. But recently, the parents began to notice very strange behavior with their son. It started during a quiet afternoon. The father was walking down the hallway past the playroom when he heard Charlie talking. At first, it sounded like normal childhood play, like he was role-playing with his action figures. But the father stopped because the conversation sounded far too realistic, as if Charlie were pausing to listen to another person in the room before speaking. The father actually walked in, half expecting to find a friend from the neighborhood, but the room was empty. Charlie was just sitting blankly at his Lego table with his WWE action figures, staring directly at the door. When the father asked who he had been talking to, Charlie shrugged his shoulders. The father tried to brush it off as an active imagination, but a cold feeling of unease lingered in the house. The next instance was actually much worse, and this time, both parents were at home to witness it. They were working in the kitchen when they suddenly heard Charlie laughing and talking out in the backyard. The mother walked to the window to see what he was doing and immediately called her husband over. Through the glass, they watched their 7-year-old son talking to thin air. He was holding a plastic toy sword, waving it slowly in front of him, as if he were demonstrating to an invisible friend how to use it. The father expressed his deep concern, but the mother tried to remain calm, suggesting that it was completely normal for a child to have an imaginary friend. Fast forward to a school night around 9 o'clock. It was approaching Charlie's bedtime, but the father was trying to be lenient and let him play for a few more minutes. Downstairs, the father heard Charlie laughing and talking to his unseen companion once again. He decided to take a quiet peek into the room. As he slowly opened the playroom door, he heard a sudden, distinct sound. It was the door of the toy closet being pulled shut. Charlie was standing in the dead center of the room, surrounded by scattered toys, staring at the closed closet door. The father asked him who was in the closet. Suddenly, a loud thud came from inside, like a heavy plastic toy being knocked off a shelf. The father asked again, his voice shaking, who was in there. Charlie looked at him and said, "George." The father marched over and swung the closet door open, expecting to find a neighborhood kid. But the closet was completely empty. Feeling terrified, the father grabbed Charlie and carried him straight to his bedroom. He told his wife what had happened, and although she thought he was joking at first, she saw the genuine terror in his eyes and realized he was serious. That night, the parents slept with their bedroom door open. In the middle of the night, the father woke up to a strange noise coming from the playroom down the hall. He woke his wife and whispered for her to follow him quietly. They tiptoed to the toy room. Charlie was not in there. He was fast asleep in his own bed, but a distinct, loud clicking sound was coming from inside the toy closet. The father gathered his courage and pulled the closet door open. The moment he did, the clicking stopped instantly. They searched through the entire closet, digging for any battery-operated toys that might have malfunctioned, but they found absolutely nothing. The next morning, the father was awakened by his wife screaming. He ran into the hallway and found her standing in the living room, holding their framed wedding photograph. The heavy wooden frame, the glass, and the photograph itself were cracked perfectly down the middle, completely separating the two of them. It looked as if a clean, invisible line had been sliced right through their memories. The family was so terrified, they packed their bags and went to stay with the grandmother for a week. They eventually returned only to put the house up for sale, and within a single month, they moved out of the home forever, leaving behind the mysterious presence they could never explain. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you spend your life driving a semi-truck across the country, you get used to the extreme isolation. You spend countless days and long, lonely nights staring at the endless stretch of gray asphalt, listening to the steady, low hum of your diesel engine. For many long-haul truckers, the road becomes a second home, and the cab of their truck is the only place they feel truly comfortable. But there is a dark, unspoken side to this profession that people rarely talk about. When you are driving down a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere at 3 o'clock in the morning, the rest of the world is completely asleep. There are no witnesses, no open businesses, and no quick way to get help if something goes terribly wrong. You are entirely on your own out there, surrounded by miles and miles of empty pitch-black land. Because of this, truck drivers often see things that they were never meant to see. They cross paths with the strange, the unexplained, and sometimes the deeply malevolent. Today, we are going to look at 3 different accounts from real truck drivers who encountered something incredibly sinister during their overnight runs. These are not supernatural ghost stories. These are real, terrifying encounters with dangerous people who were up to no good in the darkest hours of the night. Our first story takes place in the hot summer of 2017. An experienced trucker named Arthur had been driving big rigs for close to 15 years. He was a practical, down-to-earth guy who knew how to take care of himself. He had spent years dealing with difficult cargo, rough weather, and shady characters at truck stops, so he did not scare easily. On this particular night, Arthur was driving an overnight haul through the desolate Mojave Desert in California. He was transporting a massive load of expensive household appliances, and his destination was a warehouse in Arizona. The desert night was pitch black. There were no streetlights, and the moon was completely obscured by thick clouds. To make matters worse, the headlights on Arthur's semi-truck were extremely dim. He had been putting off getting them serviced for months, and now, in the absolute crushing darkness of the desert, he was really starting to regret that decision. Every few minutes, he had to strain his eyes, leaning forward in his seat, just to make out the faint white lines on the road ahead. It was exhausting work, and Arthur seriously considered pulling over to the side of the highway to sleep for a couple of hours until the sun came up. But he was on a very tight schedule, and he desperately needed the money from this delivery to pay his bills. So, against his better judgment, he decided to keep pushing forward. He figured that since the highway was basically a straight line, he would be fine as long as he kept a slow and steady pace. About an hour before sunrise, when the sky was still a deep, heavy black, Arthur saw something up ahead. A bright flash of light appeared in the distance, directly in his path. Fearing that a wild animal might be crossing the dark highway, Arthur immediately slammed his foot onto the brakes. The massive tires of his semi-truck screeched loudly against the hot pavement, and the entire cab shuddered as the heavy vehicle came to a sudden, jarring halt. When the truck finally stopped, Arthur stared out of his windshield in complete disbelief. Standing directly in front of him, parked in the exact middle of the asphalt road, was a relatively new-looking red Ford Fusion. The car was positioned perfectly over the double yellow lines, blocking both lanes of traffic. Its emergency hazard lights were flashing, casting a rhythmic amber glow across the dark asphalt. But the weirdest part of the scene was the passenger side door. It was swung wide open, gaping into the empty desert night. Arthur's massive truck had stopped just a foot or two away from the car's front bumper. If he had been driving even a few miles per hour faster, he would have crushed it. Arthur sat in his seat, trying to process what he was looking at. He was not a timid man, and he knew his way around a physical fight, so his first reaction was not fear. He was mostly just curious. He assumed that someone had experienced a mechanical breakdown and needed some help. Arthur put his truck into reverse, backed up a safe distance, and pulled over onto the dirt shoulder of the highway. He thought about throwing down some emergency flares, but he had not seen another car on the road for hours, so he decided it was not necessary. He opened his cab door and stepped down into the warm, completely still desert night. He remembered thinking how strange it was that there was absolutely no wind. The entire desert was dead silent, save for the faint, rhythmic clicking sound of the Ford's hazard lights. Click, click, click. Arthur walked cautiously toward the red sedan. As he approached the open passenger door, he leaned in to look inside. To his complete surprise, the car was entirely empty. He checked the front seats, the back seats, and even looked down on the floorboards to see if someone was hiding or injured. There was absolutely no one inside. The key was still sitting in the ignition, but the engine was turned off. Arthur felt a sudden chill run down his spine. He stood up and looked over his shoulder, scanning the dark desert landscape in every direction. The only light came from the dim high beams of his semi-truck, which only illuminated a small portion of the road. Beyond that lay a wall of pure, suffocating darkness. Arthur felt incredibly exposed. He wanted to turn around and walk back to his truck, but his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to check the trunk of the car. Arthur walked to the rear of the Ford Fusion and grabbed the trunk release handle. He pulled it, but the trunk did not open. It was locked tight. He walked back to the front of the car, reached through the open passenger door, and pulled the key out of the ignition. He walked back to the rear, inserted the key into the trunk lock, and turned it. He heard a click, but when he tried to lift the trunk lid, it still would not budge. It felt like something was holding it down from the inside. Arthur was determined to see what was hidden in there. He opened the rear passenger door and noticed that the back seats could be folded forward to grant access to the trunk. He reached in, found the release latch, and pushed the seat back down. The gap opened up, but what Arthur saw inside made his heart stop. Sitting in the trunk were 3 large, tightly packed black garbage bags. A thick, heavy rope was wrapped around the bags, tying them securely to the structural metal frame of the trunk lid. This was why the trunk would not open from the outside. The rope was holding it shut. Arthur stared at the bags, wondering what could possibly be inside them. They were too small to hold an entire human body, but they were dense and heavy. He leaned his upper body through the folded seat, reaching his hand toward the plastic bags to see what they felt like. He was just inches away from touching the nearest bag when a sound shattered the quiet night. It was the incredibly loud, deafening crack of a gunshot. The sound echoed through the empty desert, and it was so close that Arthur physically jumped, slamming his head hard against the interior roof of the car. Panic instantly took over. He did not think. He scrambled out of the back seat, threw the car keys onto the front seat, and ran toward his truck as fast as he could. As he was climbing up the metal steps of his semi-truck, he heard a rough, grungy voice shouting from the darkness. The voice was yelling, "Hey, hey," over and over again, and the sound was approaching very quickly. Arthur scrambled into his driver's seat, slammed the door, and fumbled with the keys to start the engine. In his panic, he let the clutch out too fast and the engine stalled. He cursed loudly, twisting the key again. The diesel engine roared to life just as Arthur looked out of his side mirror. Standing right by the trunk of the red Ford Fusion was a man. He was short and husky, with bright red hair, wearing denim overalls and shin-high boots. In his left hand, he was holding a small trench shovel. In his right hand, he was carrying an old, weathered hunting rifle. Arthur and the red-haired man locked eyes. The man did not look crazy, but he had a deeply worried, desperate expression on his face. As Arthur threw the truck into gear and started to pull away, the man dropped his shovel and began waving both of his hands in the air, shouting, "Wait! Wait!" But Arthur was not going to wait. He pressed his foot firmly onto the gas pedal, accelerating the massive semi-truck down the highway as fast as it would go. In his rearview mirror, he saw the red-haired man chase after the truck on foot for a few seconds before giving up and sprinting back toward his red car. Arthur drove for about 5 minutes, his heart pounding against his ribs. He started to think he was safe, but then he looked in his mirror again. 2 bright headlights were approaching him at an incredibly high speed. The red Ford Fusion was chasing him. The car pulled right up onto Arthur's bumper, tailgating him. The driver started honking the horn repeatedly, filling the cab of the truck with a blaring noise. Arthur did not know what to do. If he stopped, the man with the rifle would catch him. Arthur grabbed his phone and dialed the police, frantically explaining his location and what had just happened. For 15 agonizing minutes, the chase continued. The red car swerved back and forth behind him. Suddenly, the Ford sped up, pulled in front of Arthur's truck, and slammed on its brakes, forcing Arthur to decelerate rapidly to avoid a catastrophic crash. Just as Arthur thought he was trapped, flashing blue and red lights appeared in the distance up ahead. A police cruiser was approaching. The moment the driver of the Ford Fusion saw the police lights, he yanked his steering wheel to the right. The red car veered off the road, kicking up a massive cloud of dust, and sped off into the trackless desert, disappearing completely into the dark. Arthur pulled his truck over to the side of the road and waited for the officer. When the policeman arrived, Arthur was incredibly frustrated. He told the officer exactly what had happened and pointed in the direction the red car had fled. He urged the officer to go after him, telling him he could easily catch the suspect if he left right now. But to Arthur's disappointment, the officer refused. He insisted on taking a full report first, stating that backup was on the way and they would conduct a search later. The police sent Arthur on his way, promising to call him with an update. They never did. Arthur never found out what was in those garbage bags, or why the red-haired man was out in the middle of the desert with a rifle and a shovel. Some of Arthur's trucking buddies believed the man was disposing of a human body, and that the bags contained dismembered remains. But for his own peace of mind, Arthur likes to hope it was something else. Perhaps a farmer putting down a sick animal. But deep down, he knows that the red-haired man's desperate chase and the gunshot tell a much darker story. Our second story takes place in the chilly state of Ohio, involving a much younger driver who had a very different path into the trucking industry. Let's call him Jordan. Jordan was a bright young student who had been attending a prestigious university, but due to sudden financial hardships, he had to drop out. To make ends meet, he took a job as a long-haul truck driver. Jordan had been a stellar student at his university, majoring in engineering, and his professors had high hopes for his future. But when his family fell into severe financial ruin, He had to make the painful choice to walk away from his education. The transition from a vibrant college campus to the cramped, silent cab of a semi-truck was jarring. The silence of the road was different from the silence of a library. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that made him hyper-aware of his own heartbeat. To cope with the isolation, Jordan would often listen to the radio, but on this particular night, even the background noise could not keep his exhaustion at bay. His mind began to loop through his regrets, analyzing every decision he had made over the last year, which only made the long hours feel even longer. By the time he reached the Ohio border, the psychological weight of his situation was just as heavy as his physical tiredness. He didn't mind the work, but the extreme isolation of driving alone through the night began to take a toll on him. This incident happened just 3 months into his new career, when he was still incredibly inexperienced. He was assigned to a grueling 12-hour overnight run from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana. Jordan had already completed an 8-hour shift before starting this run, meaning he was driving on pure exhaustion. Around the halfway point, somewhere in rural Ohio, he desperately needed a caffeine boost. He reached down into his cooler, only to realize he had forgotten to restock his energy drinks. Frustrated and struggling to keep his eyes open, Jordan decided he had no choice but to pull off at the very next exit to find a convenience store. He steered his truck off the highway and pulled into what looked like a gas station, but as his headlights swept over the property, he realized the place was abandoned. The gas pumps were dark and wrapped in caution tape, and the main building was in complete disrepair. However, right next to it was a small, dusty convenience store. Hoping to find a working vending machine, Jordan parked his truck and walked toward the convenience store's entrance. He expected the door to be locked, but to his surprise, it swung open with a light push, revealing a pitch-black interior. Stepping inside, Jordan's eyes adjusted to the dark, and he noticed a faint white glow coming from a doorway at the back. He walked toward it and pushed the door open to find a clean, modern refrigerator plugged into the wall. Eager to find a drink, he pulled the door open, only to find it completely empty. The interior had been totally gutted, with all the plastic shelves and drawers removed, leaving nothing but an empty metal shell. As Jordan stood there in confusion, a loud clatter echoed from the main room, like a metal object hitting the concrete floor. He froze, listening intently, but the building returned to dead silence. Deciding not to push his luck, Jordan quickly left the building and walked to a brightly lit, open shop just a short distance up the road. He bought 2 energy drinks, paid the cashier, and walked back to his truck. But as he passed the abandoned convenience store, he noticed that the front door, which he was positive he had closed, was now standing wide open. Shaken, Jordan climbed into his cab, started the engine, and merged back onto the highway. As the caffeine began to kick in, he tried to make sense of the empty, gutted refrigerator. That was when he looked in his rearview mirror and saw something that made his blood run cold. The heavy, dark gray fabric curtains separating his driver's seat from the sleeper cabin were gently billowing and moving, even though the truck's air vents were turned off. Jordan realized with absolute terror that someone was hiding in the back of his truck. He was completely unarmed, alone on a dark highway, with an intruder sitting just inches behind his head. He desperately searched his phone's map for the nearest police station, which was 20 minutes away. Those 20 minutes were pure torture as Jordan tried to drive normally, praying the intruder would not reach out to grab him. When he finally reached the station, he slammed on the brakes, ran inside, and screamed for help. Within seconds, armed officers surrounded the truck and pulled back the sleeper cabin curtains. They dragged out 3 disheveled individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, who had been squatting in the abandoned gas station. In the hand of one of the men were 2 open switchblade knives. The 3 intruders refused to say a word, staring at Jordan with cold, silent malice as they were led away in handcuffs. Our third and final story comes from a seasoned veteran named Kevin, who had been driving for various shipping companies for over 15 years. Kevin took pride in his speed and efficiency, often pushing himself to the absolute limit of physical exhaustion to complete his deliveries early. 4 years ago, he was working for a shipping company based in North Dakota, preparing for a long overnight haul across the flat, monotonous plains into western Montana. He left the warehouse in the afternoon, planning to drive straight through the night without stopping. By midnight, Kevin was struggling to keep his eyes open. He decided to use smelling salts, a trick a fellow driver named Tristan had introduced him to. The sharp ammonia fumes jolted him awake, but 30 minutes later, the effects wore off, and he drifted onto the shoulder of the road, the loud rumble strips shocking him back to consciousness. Realizing he needed to sleep immediately, Kevin slowed down to look for a safe place to pull over. But this stretch of the highway was surrounded by nothing but dense black woods. As he scanned the muddy edge of the road, his headlights illuminated a bright, long-sleeved purple dress lying perfectly flat in the middle of his lane. Kevin rubbed his eyes, thinking he was hallucinating, but it was completely real. A few hundred yards later, he passed a pair of shoes placed neatly side by side on the asphalt. Kevin felt a deep sense of dread. He clutched his father David's old wooden cross and began to pray. Further down the road, his headlights picked up a large pile of children's clothing scattered across both lanes. Kevin brought his massive truck to a complete stop, staring at the small shirts and dresses in confusion and fear. Determined to see if a family was in trouble, Kevin stepped out of his truck into the cold night air. He walked cautiously toward the pile of clothes, but the silence of the forest was suffocating. Suddenly, he heard a very sharp, loud twig snap in the dense woods to his left. He spun around, but saw nothing in the darkness. A moment later, another crunch came from the woods to his right. Terrified, Kevin turned and sprinted back to his truck. Just as he climbed into the cab, the blood-curdling scream of a young child echoed through the trees. Kevin froze, torn between his fear and his desire to help a child in danger. But then, a second scream rang out, sounding identical in pitch and volume to the first. Kevin realized it was a recording. He quickly started his engine, put the truck in gear, and turned the steering wheel to shine his headlights directly into the trees. The bright beams cut through the dark forest, exposing 3 or 4 grown men standing in the shadows. One of them was holding a large speaker playing the pre-recorded screams. The men quickly hid behind the trees to avoid the light. Before Kevin could react, a loud thump rattled the passenger side of his truck. He slammed on the gas and accelerated down the highway. As the truck sped away, a man stepped out of the bushes, shouting angrily, and threw a heavy object that struck the passenger side window, cracking the glass. Kevin drove the rest of the way in terrified silence, completing his delivery before calling the police. He never found out who those men were or what they planned to do, but he knew he had barely escaped a calculated, deadly ambush. These chilling experiences show that the dark highways of America hold more than just long stretches of empty road. They hold secrets, desperate people, and coordinated traps that target the very drivers who keep the country moving. For Arthur, Jordan, and Kevin, their lives were forever altered by those single, terrifying nights behind the wheel. They no longer see their overnight shifts as peaceful, quiet journeys, but as gauntlets of potential danger where a single mistake or moment of curiosity could cost them everything. Arthur still drives through the desert, but he never stops for abandoned vehicles, and his headlights are always perfectly maintained. Jordan never leaves his truck unlocked, even for a few seconds at a busy truck stop, and he always thoroughly checks his sleeper cabin before putting his vehicle in gear. And Kevin never gets out of his truck for any reason when he is driving through remote areas, knowing exactly how easily a child's desperate cry for help can be faked. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.